a real neuron is really complicated and might be doing much, much more work than one neuron in an artificial neural network would do. We found that a single neuron can solve MNIST. It's a very concrete research program, and it will have trouble getting funded because it's so different to all the other things we currently do. The idea that simulations must always be a far future dream should go away. We should start simulating brains.
My guest today is Professor Konrad Kording, a computational neuroscientist known for bridging neuroscience, machine learning, and motor control. He is professor at the University of Pennsylvania, spanning neuroscience, bioengineering, and physics. He's one of the top scientists working to understand how our brains work. He's done tons of pioneering work, including some of the earliest Bayesian brain hypotheses and figuring out why control works. He's a clear contrarian thinker on what neuroscience does and does not yet understand about the brain. And he consistently pushes for more rigorous, more falsifiable models in neuroscience and beyond. Konrad, thank you for being here, and let's dive in.
Thanks so much for having me, Juan.
Great. So we're going to start from the bottom up. What is a neuron and how does it work?
Oh, that's a great question. So neurons are small structures that do all the information processing in brains. They usually have a cell body that is maybe 10 micrometer big, a hundredth of a millimeter. And then they have a piece that takes the information from other neurons. It's called a dendrite, and it might be a millimeter long. There's a large variation there. And then it has an axon, which is the wire along which it sends the signals that it produces, which may be very short, maybe just a few micrometers, or it might be all the way from the brain to the feet of the giraffe, which would be meters in scale. And the way in neuroscience, how we think about them is that they are input-output devices. We have inputs, they're called the synapses from other neurons. It's putting all these inputs together, produces an output, which is spikes. And ultimately, these spikes control your body and are the basis of all the interactions that happen in your brain.
And when a neuron interacts with another neuron, what are the different, how does that communication happen through the synapse?
Yeah, so in most cases, neurons are what we call spiking. So there's an electrical signal that comes out of the neuron, and that then reaches the synapse, which is the place where they meet one another. Where it reaches that in so-called chemical synapses, we have this phenomenon where the cell where the signal comes from throws a lot of chemicals out of the cell. And the next cell that it's connected to, the downstream neuron, basically has receptors for these chemicals. We call those chemicals neurotransmitters. And these chemicals then, once they bind the receptors, produce an influence on the postsynaptic cell. Usually that is just a current. It happens by having ion channels. Just like a battery, they open and then the ions go through it. Current produces the signal on the postsynaptic side. And that is the basis of computation in neurons and brains.
You said most neurons are spiking neurons. What are the non-most neurons?
Yeah, there are some neurons that are what we call analog neurons, where you can say what changes over time is the voltage in it. So a spike is something that is either there or it's not there. It's like a telegraph signal, like beep, 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 and it arrives on the other side. Whereas analog neurons, you can think about it more like wires that can go up and down and are just graded signals. Much of computation in human brains is in terms of spiking neurons. Much of the computation in very small systems, maybe worms or something, is graded. Much of the information processing in your eyes, in your retina, is graded, is analog. And then the outputs from your eye are spiking. And then basically the eye signal sends a signal to the rest of the brain. That's the basis of seeing.
And how do all these different functions get computed in the brain? In the computer science model that we have a very simple abstraction where we tend to look at a neuron as just one mathematical object with a set of inputs coming through and then firing out. And they're effectively the same everywhere. But brain neurons aren't like that, right? Like they're very different. There are many different types.
Yeah, there's lots of different neurons in brains, and I think their function is much more complicated. Where you can say, so in the neuron, I told you there's a lot of synapses that go there, roughly 10,000, depending on where you are in the brain. And what happens is every synapse produces a current on the postsynaptic side, but it's not as in computer science where we say the output of the neuron is just the sum of all the input that goes, but we have local synapses, and they do something nonlinear. For example, we have this thing called NMDA spikes, where you have a couple of synapses, and if they're all active at the same time, they're much more strong than if just one of them comes. And then we have, if we go from these very local pieces on the dendrite to more global pieces, we have things that's called calcium spikes, where you can say the neuron is very active for some period of time, maybe a tenth of a second, and then ultimately we have the spiking in the neurons. So when people do that analysis, where they ask how complex do neurons appear to be, and it's based on some simulations, so take it with a grain of salt, but I think the best way of thinking about it is that a given neuron is a little bit like a 3-layer, 4-layer neural network that just has one output. So in that sense, you can say that a real neuron is really complicated and might be doing much, much more work than one neuron in an artificial neural network would do.
That's a very good insight of modeling. So we could model one neuron with, like a four-layer artificial neural network. I think, is there some kind of estimate on the parameter count that like an average neuron might have? Because that implies a lot of different parameters and a lot of computation that is happening in one single organic neuron.
Yeah, I think that you need a very large number to describe the computation in one neuron. Imagine you have 10,000 synapses. It's not that you now have 10,000 parameters, which is one weight for each of them. It's much worse. So there turns out to be that there's some connections that are very fast, and something happens and then it's gone. And there's other connections that are much, much slow. There are excitatory and inhibitory ones. There are those where two inputs, if they come immediately after one another, it's like the second one doesn't count. We call that depressing. And then there's the opposite of facilitating. If just one input comes, very little happens. But if two of them happen, one right after the other, it's a very strong signal. So all these things, we need parameters for it. So I think there's going to be at least 10 parameters for each synapse. That number of synapses or that number of parameters, now we're at maybe 100,000 per cell, but there's a lot of extra ones coming from the local nonlinear properties of dendrites. We have these things called ion channels that can amplify signals, they can weaken signals, they can make signals nonlinear. There might be 1 million of them on a cell. So the number of parameters that we need to describe a cell is undoubtedly very, very large.
Across like different types of organic neurons, do they follow at least a set of patterns where you roughly, like if you were to kind of model one organic neuron with a particular structure of an artificial network, is that viable? Or are they just so uniquely tuned that it's kind of like learning for each individual neuron, you would have to like learn a different network from scratch?
Yeah, I think every neuron is different, and they have to be, because what do neurons do? They embody what we know about the world. So if they were all identical, they couldn't store any information. They must all be different, and because they're all different, they have lots of parameters, and therefore, if we want to model them well, we need to use lots of parameters.
Well, but pushing back on that, like the artificial neural networks are all mathematically identical. They store the differences in like different parameter weights. The network structure of the artificial neuron is identical while the parameter is different. And so here you're saying in organic neuron terms, how different are they? Is it like the more variable like a parameter setting, or is it just like the actual wiring and structure of them is just so fundamentally different one neuron to the next that it's very difficult to like generate a model that can kind of abstract between them?
I think they're all very different, and yet they're all the same. And let me highlight what I mean with it. So you could say, if I describe what a neuron does with its inputs, indeed, they're nonlinear and they're all different from one another. But if you zoom into it and ask how it works, they all work in the same way, which is there are ion channels on it, there are synapses on it. The synapses and ion channels produce electrical currents on that neuron. And then that neuron uses these electrical currents that get integrated by the physics of the cable equation, integrates all of that. And after integrating it, it produces an output. And that output is sent to the axon. There are like it's biology. Evolution does whatever works. So there's slight variations of it where you can say sometimes a neuron tells something to another neuron that doesn't go through this axonal output. And those are the areas where we don't quite know how big these effects are. But those effects do exist. So for example, if you have two neurons that are just like touching one another, even if there's no axon from one to the other, the fact that they touch, if one of them is electrical active, the other one is electrically influenced by the first one. It's called aphatic coupling. And that means that two neurons that are right next to one another will influence one another beyond just the axons.
Yeah, you mentioned the cable equation. So what are the computational models that we've built to represent neurons today? And what's sort of like the zoo of different models that we've tried, and like what has worked and what hasn't worked?
Yeah, so there's a continuum of abstract to more realistic models. Let's start with the realistic model. The realistic model basically thinks about the neuron like that, where you can say the neuron has this dendritic tree. If we zoom into the physics of that, it's a little bit not like what is the dendritic tree? It basically is water and salt on the inside. And we know in physics how we should think about water and salt. Current can flow through it, has a certain amount of resistance locally. And you can say a long branch of a dendrite might just be like lots of resistors, one after the other. There's also around that the cell membrane. Now, how should we think about the cell membrane? It's a little bit like a capacitance to the outside of that. Now, different cells have different lengths of that, and they branch out, and they might be thin or thick, or they might have a thick layer around it or thin layer around it, which from a physics perspective just means that different sets of resistors, different numbers of them, maybe a tree of resistors, maybe some of them have bigger capacitance than others. But they all feed into like that same way of thinking, that a cell is basically lots of resistors, which lots of capacitance, and lots of sources of currents. Now let's talk about sources of currents. Now, like, how does a current go into it? If we zoom all the way into it, we have an ion channel. There's a mechanism that opens it often and one that closes it. If it's open, it means that ions will go through it. It's like attaching a little battery with a resistor to it. And that's how we model it when we try to build very realistic models. And then you can say we have the synapses. It's the same as an ion channel, only that it also matters what comes from the presynaptic neuron. So at some level, we have a very coherent way of thinking about it. Let me highlight the places where it gets more complicated, which is within the cells, we have a lot of molecules that influence that. So an ion channel is regulated by intracellular biochemical processes. That's a place where complexity comes in, and that's a place where we are not that certain about how that complexity works. There's aspects that we understand very well. For example, if you have a spike, the most famous model basically says we just have like one piece of axon. It's like little resistors between with capacitances to the outside. Only that there's also this thing which lets in more current when the voltage is very high. And then once the voltage was high for a bit, it makes the voltage low again. And this is what gives rise to the spikes, where you reach the place where it starts, then the voltage goes high, and then it goes down again. And if you put this across space, it like sends a spike through the axon and transmits it to other neurons. And we understand it at that level very well. Now, when it comes to the nonlinear regulation phenomena that happen there, like there's just a voltage-gated sodium channel that we need for that. That is still relatively simple. In reality, there's these things, we call them second messengers, where various cellular phenomena affect ion channels in complex ways. And learning is just the extreme way of that, where there's a process that, if you want, starts a molecular cascade that ultimately changes how strong a synapse is, but also if new synapses get started.
Going back to kind of like the different model. So we have like some realistic description, both in physics, and then, you can build a computational model of that. But now that would be kind of way too granular and way too detailed. So like let's start like kind of abstracting out, like what are more abstract kind of computational structures that can represent what the neuron is doing to like a great degree, but maybe it's like losing some information.
Yeah, so let's go to the abstractions we use. Like a cable equation model is expensive to simulate because you end up simulating every little piece, every resistor, every capacitance. And on top of it, it's nonlinear and with inputs that change over time. So it's very difficult, very expensive computation to simulate that. There's various abstractions of that. There are ways, for example, where you can say we take the cable equation, which tries to model like every little piece of the cell. And you can say, let's just coarse grain that, where you can say, maybe I take everything that originally was 100 resistors and I replace it with one resistor that's approximating what the system does, then I have just fewer resistors, fewer capacitances. It's easier for me to simulate. We can go to the next step of abstraction where we can say, well, let's assume that all the dendrites don't overly matter. And that gives us the integrate and fire neuron. The idea there is we take every synapse, we see on average how strongly does it influence the voltage at the soma, at the cell body of the neuron. We then pretend that all this complicated dendrite with its delays and timescales and nonlinearities and so forth doesn't exist. It's just all linearly added to it. Integrate and fire, it at least produces spikes. It's the basis of many works in spiking neural networks, which is a branch of artificial neural networks with the promise of making computation a lot more efficient. And then we can go further to what we call a rate model, where we can say, yeah, there's time, but time is fast. And if you want, like over the period of a second, we might have a spike or multiple spikes. And therefore, it doesn't matter all that much of what all those biophysics are. It's enough to know as a function of how many spikes come in, how many spikes come out. And so you have this whole continuum of biological realism there.
What do you guess is going to be the right computational model to then start, building larger and larger scale representations and networks where you can like recapitulate behavior well? Meaning, like, can you truly abstract it all the way to leaky, integrated, and fire type of structure, or do you need like something much more real? Like, what do you think right now, or like how do you think that might develop over time?
I think there's the information processing in the cell actually truly matters because there's strong nonlinearities and nonlinearities is the basis of artificial neural networks. So the idea that you can take one very simple thing that just adds things and then thresholds it and gives you the spikes in the way we do in artificial neural networks, I think is wrong. But what we can do is we can now use machine learning to say, well, here you have the simulation of the neuron that's really expensive. We want to simulate it fast. And it's fine if it costs us some time to understand that. We call that amortized inference, where we run our simulations a lot and do a lot of computational analysis with the idea that we first put in a lot of compute and then later it's cheap to do that. You can say a neuron, a realistic neuron that gets lots of inputs, and has outputs that change over time. We can still use machine learning to approximate it, where you can say, what does a neuron do? It gets like a couple thousand inputs as a function of time. It still just computes a function on that. We can use machine learning to approximate that function. And in all likelihood, we can do that pretty efficiently. And in fact, there's some work that already does that. If I tell you that complicated neuron can maybe be approximated by a 3-layer neural network, well, you can simulate that 3-layer neural network massively faster than the cable equations for a neuron. So there is this path by which we can take realistic neurons and in principle take those neuron models and move it into the space where we can really efficiently simulate it. And I think that that's essential if we want to build big things.
What are the sort of functions that you think each of these neurons is calculating? Because at least in artificial neural networks, you get to use these very simple linear algebra style functions, and you build the complexity out of the layers of in the stack. When you want to learn and approximate some like more complex function, you're just doing it across the layers where each individual neuron is not actually very complicated. But it sounds here the dynamics of a single organic neuron are so complicated that it could actually be learning, one single neuron could be learning a very complex function on its own.
Yeah, it's great that you mentioned that because we've done some fun research there, where you can say we took a neuron that was somewhat realistic, and we asked, could a single neuron solve a machine learning task? And we found that a single neuron can solve MNIST. So for people who don't know MNIST is basically you put in the image of a number, and it tells you what number that is, and it uses real US Postal Service data. So everyone writes numbers differently. I'm from Germany. The way I do the number 1 is different to the way you do it. And yet it recognizes all of them. And so what we did in that study, we took a neuron with all the parameters that they have. It was still a somewhat approximated, somewhat simplified neuron. And then we asked, can we train that neuron with all the free parameters so that it would recognize if something is, say, a number 7 versus a number 1? A single neuron can do that very well, actually. therefore, you can say that it just gives you an example that the power is higher. But at the same time, if we take a model of that neuron and we make it very efficient, no, it's still structured, where you can say there is a place where the two parts of the neuron, the two dendritic branches meet. That still means that not all possible three-layer neural networks could be implemented. It needs to be one where information meets, and then it meets other information, ultimately produce the output of the neuron. And so in that sense, it might rather be that these realistic neurons make it easier to compute these complex functions because they have a lot of structure, and sparseness and structure just promises to make a lot of computations better.
When you mentioned the 3 to 4 layers, I immediately thought of MNIST. So that's awesome that that actually has been done. Have we pushed into the limits of that? Like, what is like the most complex things that we have gotten single neurons to try to do, and where do they sort of break down? What kind of functions are they like just not able to then figure out?
I think in principle, a single neuron could probably compute a lot of the functions that a three-layer neural network can. So what we did in that area, and there's emerging literature like pushing it further, and I think you can push it a lot further. But MNIST is famous for being a somewhat old-fashioned machine learning problem because it's just basically binary drawings of numbers, and there are more interesting models that people use today. CIFAR 10, for example, is one of them, where you have just 10 different object classes. There's fashion MNIST. They're still simple. Don't think of it as an LLM or something, but they're pretty complicated tasks. A single neuron could solve those problems pretty well as well. I think, there's no doubt that it won't be able to do an LLM, and you can say there's something about the number of parameters. So a neuron has 10,000 parameters. We shouldn't expect a neuron to be able to do more than an ANN with about 10,000 parameters. So you can say 10,000 parameters is kind of like the machine learning year 1995 state. But machine learning 1995 does an awful lot of like non-trivial things. Yeah. So I think we are not giving neurons enough credit for all the things that they could be doing.
Super powerful. And in the 3-layer that you're describing, or 3 to 4-ish, does that come from the dendritic structure, or does that come from the parameter space of the individual synapses? Or
it comes from the structure of the dendrites. If you look at a dendrite, it's this tree-like structures. It really looks like a tree. Look at Ramon y Cajal's drawing. You kind of like it almost looks like it. In fact, we had a fun little paper where we quantified how similar trees are to neurons, and we found that they're remarkably similar. And so it's a bit of a tree, and you can say in that tree, wherever two branches meet, you have the chance to combine two signals. So I think that's where the 3 layers comes from.
And is it as straightforward as just, if you just take a snapshot of the neuron and you trace the tree structure, you can kind of represent that with like a logical neural network following that same tree structure? Or does it get much more complicated than that?
That's how we did it. There's nice research from Idan Segev, who kind of looks more holistically at that. But I think first order approximation, this take a neuron that has tree structure and model it by an artificial neural network that has tree structure is a pretty good approximation.
Great. So this is kind of covers single neurons to some degree. When we start kind of putting them together into larger and larger units, into small circuits, and then later like larger and larger networks, how do those work? And what are the kind of communication pathways that we see? Right. So in artificial neural networks, we have constrained ourselves to build, like most of the deep learning structures just have these single directional neural networks where things are just kind of flowing in one pass, just because that makes the learning algorithms much easier. But organic neurons are not like that. There's all kinds of like recurrence and channels coming back. And can you maybe speak to that a bit? And like, what is the complexity when we try to model these like circuits?
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the first complexity already, which is in say a transformer architecture. We have strict feed-forward transmission of information. There's one layer, it goes to the next layer, goes to the next layer, and eventually you're finished. In the brain, it looks very different. If in the brain, let's say we're both neurons, I talk to you, and you'll very likely talk back to me, or if not directly, kind of your team talks with my team. That's roughly the logic in brains. So you have this massive recurrence where it goes one direction and it comes back. I think it's not that disjunct from modern machine learning, where a lot of people in machine learning use recurrent neural networks. And I think they're having a bit of a recurrence these days, resurgence, where we want to allow systems to feed back information. I think that's crucial. It's incredibly useful. But let's first talk about what we know biologically. The brain has hundreds of different brain areas, many structures. Neurons look different in all of them. In general, there's this pattern that if it goes from one place to another place, it usually comes back from the other place to the first place, is a general pattern that by and large holds.
And this is sort of different channel, so like information flowing down, or is it use the exact same channel back?
Yeah, no, it projects slightly differently. So if you look at cortex, which is the area that most people study, there's parts of cortex that send the signal up, and then there's the neurons that are up send the signals and they come back in a different place. So they come to the superficial layers and they're more being sent forward from the deeper layers in cortex. So there is structure there. So if you want, it's useful from a learning perspective and from a processing perspective that kind of information is separated and you know what comes from the bottom and you know what comes from the top. And I think that is very important.
Yeah, and it's very useful algorithmically. Like that's the basis for machine learning rules. It's like separation of information is what lets you do like the feed forward and backprop learning and all that kind of stuff, right? And so some of the tension in between the two fields is that in artificial neural networks we get to do this global computation, whereas in organic neurons we don't, or we have to figure out how to represent the global computation in a local way.
Yeah, so let's break down these two things. So there's the first thing, which is processing. If you make a decision, if you want to say a word, say, information in your brain will go forward and backwards and forwards 3 layers and then backwards 2. It kind of goes back and forth all the time until the decision is made by your brain to like say a given word. If you look at an artificial neural network, it only goes forward. Now, in the artificial neural network, information also goes backwards, but it's only information for learning. In the artificial neural network, at the end, was this a good thing or a bad thing? And then you kind of go back and say like, hey, I did this bad thing and you were responsible. And then the neuron that was responsible says like, okay, but those guys were responsible for me being active. And then those guys kind of like, that is how the so-called credit assignment problem is solved in AI. In the brain, it's much less clear how it works. So like it's clear you need to know if you want to get better at learning. You somehow need to know, well, should I as a neuron have been more active or should I have been less active? Otherwise, how do you know if you should do it differently next time? So this credit assignment problem kind of intuitively clearly needs to be solved. I need to know how I should change. In AI, we know how we do that. We have a very efficient algorithm called backpropagation that tells every neuron if it should be more or less active, and every neuron tells it to the weights between them, the synapses, if you want. In brains, we don't know. It's clear that somehow if you want to get better, it means that the neurons where it helps if they're more active, they must become more active, and the neurons where it helps that they are less active must become less active. We know that. It's a simple mathematical proof that on average that needs to be happening. But how that works is very unclear. Like every neuron constantly talks with lots of other neurons, and somehow out of this dynamics must emerge something which tells the right neurons to become more active and the wrong neurons to become less active.
In neural networks, we get to apply this whole learning structure on top of the entire network, the feed forward and backpropagation model with like the whole network gradient descent works in great part because we know the bounding box of this entire network, and we know what is a feed forward pass, what is a backprop pass, and there's a whole string of papers that try to inspect both the artificial neural networks and organic neural networks to try and figure out, is the brain doing something similar to that or a totally different type of learning? Because recurrent neural networks in the artificial models are notoriously very hard to train because of this bounding box problem and like the computation getting very messy. The brain has to be doing something locally, right? Like not whole brain synchronized. The learning and the algorithms have to be, at least if not in a single neuron, in some like local patch of some sort, or maybe this is the quick question. Like, what do we know?
No, let's talk about physics.
Yeah.
Imagine you're like a synapse somewhere in the brain. What information can you possibly have? No, the only thing that you can know locally is what did the upstream neuron do, what did the downstream neuron do. And it turns out there's this thing called backprop getting action potential, where basically if the cell that I'm on as a synapse is active, I'm going to hear it. It's like everyone knows that that just happened because that's where we are locally. And then we can like maybe see locally a few so-called neurotransmitters. So there's neurotransmitters that kind of seem to be related to like this was good or this was unexpectedly bad. So there is the possibility that I have some information there, but mostly I just see what happened of the pre-neuron, what happened to me.
In those neurotransmitters, A, what are those? And B, do they happen locally or in like larger areas or globally?
Yeah, so there's a lot unknown about it, but there's suddenly dopamine seems to tell you about expected reward. And then there's a huge literature that shows that this approximation is a really bad approximation. No, but like there's some experiments, beautiful experiments by Schultz that basically say, you give me a reward that I don't expect, someone comes in, gives me some coffee, dopamine will be like, yep, great. And then alternatively, I expect coffee. Someone comes in like, sorry, no coffee right now. And the dopamine neurons will go like, ooh, that's sad. And so there is this way of representing those things, but reality is much more complicated. And that's because I think like signals, not like for an AI system, we have a so-called reward function or loss function, depending on which field you're in. You're just like, here's better, here's worse. It's very simple. But for us as humans, it's not like better or worse is that simple. Not like what is better versus worse on a word that you just produced. There's a word that might be like, you look at my face, I frown when you say something. So like that's one source. But also you might be like, well, that didn't quite sound right. And you might be like, this is a strategically pragmatic word in this context. And the listeners on my podcast will not like this word. So there's all these things layered on top of one another. And in AI, it's clear there's just like one function that kind of says how good or bad that was. For us, there's a lot of things layered. For example, we know there's other neuromodulators, say serotonin or something, that seem more related to like, hey, that mattered. You should probably pay attention and not forget what just has happened. So there are these extra dimensions on it. And I think in AI, we're building them into systems. Now we're weighing, we're like, this is an important stimulus and this is not. And gradient descent does a little bit of that, but we're trying to like do that even better. So there's these layers of complexity that I think are much better for biological systems than they are for AI.
Yeah, going back to the kind of building larger and larger networks. And so there's the algorithms that we might need to run, like learning, maybe digging into learning. Most artificial networks effectively have one learning paradigm, and maybe you can look at the current transformer architectures as maybe patching some additional learning processes on top through RLHF and all these other things. But for the most part, like the pre-training process is just one main single algorithm. What do we know about the brain, and how does learning in the brain happen? Is there a bunch of different algorithms? Are these maybe localized separately? Are the neurotransmitters triggering different algorithms? Or is it just tuning a single algorithm in a way? Like, what do we actually know?
Let's maybe start with the theory. So there's always a theory space in neuroscience, a theorizing space, a sense-making space, and a data space. Let's first talk about the theory space, because A, I know a lot about that space, and B, that's, if you want, is a starting point that people have. So there exists a space where people say, well, maybe the brain is relatively simple. And no, maybe the brain is evolutionarily already set up to do almost everything. And then you just need to add like a little layer of learning to it. Tony Zader is one of the people proposing that, where you could say, if most of it is pre-wired, then maybe we just need a little bit of extra learning. That's this one set of theories. Let's say it's relatively simple. Why is this great? Credit assignment is not much of a problem. If the whole brain is just like, its evolution gives us the things, we just need to say if A goes with B, like, not like, does the word blue go with color blue? It's a simple learning space, and maybe like a simple learning algorithm can work. Now, most people that I talk with don't believe that it can be this simple. And why can't it be that simple? Because language is really complicated, and we live in a really complicated world. And if simple learning could succeed in this world, probably the world would be very different. Like, I believe the world is truly unbelievably complicated. And I believe that because the outside world is so complicated, our brain is complicated. So if you then go towards more complicated algorithms, a lot of the algorithms that we believe could actually work in a complicated world require credit assignment. Like, if you make a mistake, there's like an unlimited number of ways how something could be a mistake. And because of that, you need to find out what's the reason for that mistake. And that goes into both directions. That goes into the inside of the brain, like which neurons screwed this up. And it goes into the outside world, which is kind of like, how is the world such that this wasn't a good idea? And so if we have these more complicated algorithms, we need to solve the credit assignment problem. Like, what was the nature of the mistake that we just did? And if we need to solve it, we need a way of figuring out what went wrong. And there is this, and gradient descent is how we do it in AI. And there exists a large set of proposals how the brain could do it. Now, let's see what they have in common. They have all in common that they're built of things that is purely local. Like, the synapse only knows what happens locally. The neuron only knows what happens locally. Everything that it knows about the wider world, it must have been told that by its neighbors. Not like because it only talks with its neighbors. There is no global, like an extra human being like tell us what it is, or at least to our knowledge at the moment. I mean, like, sure, like maybe happens to divine intervention into all our neurons, but as long as we believe in a like mostly physical world, the problem, like kind of that information must somehow become locally. So we have a lot of algorithms that explain how purely local things, neurons talking with their neighbors, can ultimately still figure out how we should do credit assignment. And let's talk about the simplest version of that. The simplest version is a way how a biological brain could actually approximate gradient descent really, really well. Imagine it goes through the brain. Let's ignore the fact that it always goes back and forth. It goes through the brain. In the end, you do something. Then you find out if this was a good idea or not. And then, if it was a bad idea, you have a neuron kind of that says, you did this and that was a bad idea. And then you have, for every neuron in the brain, kind of like a twin, which kind of says, I think you did something wrong. And then this set of like neurons with their twins, think about it like, what do you know, like in Star Wars, no, you have like the Sith, where there's always the master and the apprentice, and kind of like you have a master for every neuron, a like twin that basically says this was good or this was bad. And then they tell the other neurons, well, the neuron that I'm the master of, like, did it wrong, and you guys were part of that. And then they tell that to like that training twin of them, and it kind of goes all the way that way. That way, you produce something that's almost exactly like gradient descent. It just requires twice as many neurons. It requires the trainer neurons, and it requires the student neurons.
And so this would imply there's a set of circuits of running the actual computation, and a set of then parallel circuits going back propagating the learning information.
That's right. And of course, if you want, biologically, that's totally realistic. But it's totally not what we are seeing. Like, if we stick an electrode somewhere in the brain, say in the visual system, we have neurons that are very active. If we show them a little black thing, or like a black line on white background or something, we don't see kind of neurons, well, you should have been more active for that black line. Now, parts of that reason could be that we wouldn't see them, like because most of the time your visual system probably gets it right by the time you're an adult. So it would be hard to see them even if it was like that. But the other one is you can say it should predict that there's kind of this subnetwork that kind of runs something else than the first network. We're not really seeing something like that. You could say in terms of connectomics, ways of quantifying how networks like really make their connections, we don't see kind of like these parallel networks. That's one theory. Not like there's an extreme theory that very few people would hold because the data doesn't go along with it. But there's versions of that where you can say, well, I don't actually need a twin. It could, for example, be the same neuron at a different time, where you could say there is a part where the neurons tell you what to do, And then there's another time where they're like, okay, let's like kind of fix ourselves so that we wouldn't have done that. And there's a lot of algorithms that have been proposed as theories of how brains learn that basically do that, where you use the dynamics, right? If you want, like the neuron has a time where it makes the decision and a time where it learns. In the first one, it's, if you want, feature-like. It represents something that's in the outside world. And at the second time, it's more learning, like it tells you what was good and what was bad. Walter Sen has a version of that algorithm. Blake Richards was involved. Joshua Benjo has a version of that algorithm. Even me during my PhD had a version of that algorithm. What these algorithms all have in common is there's no blatant biology violation, and there's no evidence that the brain does it like that. So we don't know from the theory side. So what we do know is that the brain could be doing it realistically. Now, there's this thing, if I think about evolution, we know that algorithms that do something like backpropagation, like gradient descent, are really great and work on real-world AI prompts, and that algorithms that don't do anything like that aren't very good. So in that sense, I believe that evolution is amazing, and we have a very long history, and you should have expected that kind of real brains that do the right thing, that do good algorithms, that if it's realistic, if it's easy, as in those algorithms, they're all like really pretty simple algorithms that people propose. If it's easy, then biology should have figured it out. So that's why people in that field, realistic gradient descent, or however you want to call that field, I think we all agree the brain should be doing something like that. Therefore, because of evolutionary thinking, we should strongly believe that the brain is doing something like that. But the data, the evidence for that is really weak. Now, let's talk about what the evidence is that we have. The first evidence is that learning in biological beings is pretty amazing. You make a mistake, you grab like a coffee cup, you make a mistake, you'll be like this. Next time you don't make that mistake. Imagine the cup is heavier than you thought. And I've done some experiments. I've done some movement science in my past. You do some mistakes with your coffee cup. Next time you're like 30% better, like half a second later. And in general, if you look throughout the biological kingdom at learning problem, like we always get better at things. So therefore, we kind of know that learning must be good, because if it wasn't good, it doesn't look like you try some stuff and like, oh, this time I was even worse at picking up my coffee cup.
Yeah, there's very few examples, compared to like the millions that we use for artificial neural networks today.
That's right. You get better at pretty much everything. Now, that is not true for a lot of neural networks. If you're not very careful with it, if you like make them learn very fast, you're often worse. And that's despite the fact that we built in a lot of like these tricks. So it seems that like the algorithm used by the brain is very good. We know that it's biologically realistic, and the relevant experiments haven't been made yet. So let me talk you through what we know biologically. So we know that there are Hebb-like phenomena. You have a local synapse. If the presynaptic and the postsynaptic neurons are active at the same time, the synapse might get stronger or weaker.
Neurons that wire together and fire together will fire together more.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. We'll wire together more.
Yeah.
So it's a little bit like gradient descent. So imagine the neuron that you get input from isn't active at all. Why would you change the weight? Because the weight from the presynaptic neurons would not make any difference at all. Imagine the neuron after the synapse isn't active at all. Why would you want to change the weight? Well, the neuron's not active. There's no change that will make it active. So you can say that if the brain wants to do something like gradient descent locally, things should kind of look a lot like Hebbian learning. Like no activity pre, no learning, no activity post, no learning, because gradients are zero if nothing is active. We can go further and say if the presynaptic neuron is active before the postsynaptic neuron, we have a lot more plasticity. Well, if your presynaptic neuron was active afterwards, it cannot change you because, well, it's not active before you do things. Therefore, there's no influence, and therefore the gradient is zero, and therefore you shouldn't be learning there. So if you look at these local plasticity findings, they kind of look like they're a little bit like gradient descent. Now, Does the brain do gradient descent? We don't know, because the experiments for that have not been done, because the people who do synaptic plasticity, they kind of look microscopically what's happening in the cell. They usually wouldn't have they often use slicers. It's all very local. They wouldn't know what the gradients would be. So they can't quite test the big idea there. And then there's a cultural thing, which is the people who work on gradient descent in brains, they tend to be AI adjacent. They tend to not sit in active biology labs. So the theories that they come up with usually don't get tested. So we are at this moment where, if you want, we believe that brains do things that are pretty much like AI, and we have microscopic data that's kind of compatible with that. But there is no clean, convincing paper that the brain actually does it. And that's despite the fact that it's pretty obvious how to do that experiment. It's just that the forces never align to make that question be answered.
Let's talk about the limitations experimentally. We have the ability to grow neurons, separately from brains. We have some amount of ability to look into specific brains and record small areas of the brain. We haven't figured out how to record large-scale full brains, but maybe we can record C. elegans and smaller organisms. Maybe talk us through what can we figure out experimentally today? What is the current state of the art in our ability to record and understand and generate the data that we need to then figure out how to test theories. And then separately, where do you see this going? How is the measurement and recording landscape evolving?
Let me first briefly sketch the experiment, how we'd find out if the brain does gradient descent. And then I give you a broader overview of what are the tools in our toolkit. So what is gradient descent? It's a very simple idea. It says if it would make your decisions less bad, if the neuron was more active, if it would make your decisions better, then the neuron should become more active. And if it would make your decisions better, if the neuron was less active in that given situation, it should become less active in that given situation. It's a very intuitive rule here. Now, you can combine two experiments that a lot of people in this world do that would directly ask that question. The first one is, if you want to know if a neuron makes you better or worse at a task, you can absolutely do that. You can go in and you stimulate the neuron in a given situation that changes the behavior. Therefore, it makes you better or worse at the task. And a lot of people have run these experiments where they brain region in an animal, show how it changes behavior, and of course the behavior changes how good the animal is at that. So that's one piece. That, if you want, mathematically is forward differentiation. You go into a function, you change something, and you see, does the output go up or does the output go down? And you just, what you want to do is how much does it go up and divide it by how many extra spikes you did, which is then the derivative of the output, the reward, if you want, after the activity of the neuron. That's the first thing. That's what we call a gradient. A gradient just means how much better it gets if you make it more active. Then what you need to know is how that change now happens. You can do a different experiment that a lot of people do, where you say, I take the brain, I record from it, then I give a learning task to an animal, and I ask, do the neurons change? Lots of people have done that. If you want to test if the brain does gradient descent, you just need to correlate those two. It means that those neurons where making them more active makes you better at the task should be the neurons that become more active if you actually do give them that task. It's a direct test. Now, we can do that because people are doing both these experiments. It's just no one does both of these experiments at the same time. There's nothing holding back people from doing that, apart from the fact that a lot of people have, if you want, this idea of take AI as a way of thinking about brains isn't yet an established way of thinking in neuroscience. So I think that's why those experiments haven't been done.
Interesting.
And now let's talk a little bit about our toolkit at neuroscience. So one of the things that make me so excited about neuroscience is this dramatic explosion of toolkits. So in the past, we could record from a small number of neurons. Recording from 100 neurons was heroic when I was a PhD student. Now you can buy one device, stick it into a brain. It records from 1,000 of them. And of course, you can stick a whole bunch of them into it. So we can now record from lots of neurons. My lab discovered this thing called Stephenson's law, which is it doubles every 6 years, the number of neurons that you record simultaneously. But there's now these modern techniques coming that promise millions, potentially more at the same time. We can do much larger numbers by going optically into brains than going electrically. So there's this thing, we can get far more data out of brains when it comes to the electrophysiology of it. We now have molecular tools to do these things. We know there's many different cell types, and we can make it that we can only record from the neurons that are like type 17 interneuron with the following molecular properties. It's like the rest of the brain becomes invisible, and you see only those neurons that are of the molecular type that you currently want to study. Unbelievably cool. Optogenetics. You can Diceroth and Boyden popularized that. It's a protein they found in some algae. It basically is this molecule. You shine light on it. It lets in current. Letting in current makes the neurons more active or less active, depending on what kind of current you let in. So with optogenetics, you can basically go in, you illuminate a neuron, and it becomes active. Now you can illuminate one neuron or a group of neurons. You can illuminate them again. You can like make them go up. You can make them go down. It's kind of like you can play it like a piano. Unbelievably cool. Even like these latch and release techniques, you shine in one color of light, and every cell memorizes what it was doing at that point of time. Like I was very active. I wasn't active. And then you shine another light on it, and the neurons that were active basically like replay being active. They all get activated. The ones that weren't active don't replay getting active. So you can kind of like recreate a brain state, if you want, like unbelievably cool. No, like, and then come all these anatomical techniques. We were always able to use EM to reconstruct a neuron, and I got my PhD in a lab where Kevin Martin was doing these experiments, and it's unbelievable. No, like they were basically drawing the neurons by hand, and it took forever to do that, and it was really unbelievably complicated. And now we have these automated machines. They have like 100 beams at the same time, and we have AI algorithms that like draw the neurons, and they don't draw one neuron. They draw like 1 million neurons, and it's just that speed of development is unbelievable. We've done some analysis. Imaging is getting cheaper by a factor of 2, like every 18 months or something. It's unbelievable. It's almost, imaging is getting cheaper almost as fast as AI is getting cheaper. So we have like all these techniques that are coming online. And by and large, we're asking the same questions we asked 70 years ago. We just like do it with more neurons and with more beautiful neurons. And now we can see them. But how to really like gain deeper insights with it, I think we're still working on it.
Part of the answer there might just be a scale thing, right? Like, in artificial neural networks, you just had to wait until the networks were big enough to be able to compute some very complicated things. So maybe now that we have the ability to look at millions of neurons, then we now have the scale of data required to be able to kind of like build much more robust models, potentially. Or
yeah, that's the idea. But let me push on where we're like failing at even seemingly simple things. There is this worm that has arguably the simplest nervous system that exists. It's called C. elegans. It has a huge behavioral repertoire. It like forages for food, it finds partners, it lays eggs, it does everything you and me do minus the talking. Kind of like almost. Yeah. But it kind of has a really rich repertoire of things that it does. It only uses 300 neurons to do that. And we can't simulate it. No, like that's 300 neurons. We can see them all at the same time. Why can't we simulate it? Well, why can't we simulate it is because, and we know all the wires in it. We know we have a name for each of the 300 neurons that it has. We know a lot about the molecular properties of that. We know every single wire that exists there. And we don't know it just for one worm. We know it for a handful of them. We kind of like, in principle, have all that information. And yet our simulations are barely worth the papers that we print them on. My own lab tried to simulate C. elegans based on that information. We're horrible at it. And so basically, we have these like explosion of techniques, and yet we're not able to simulate relatively simple systems.
Yeah, so why not? Yeah, there's been a range of projects trying to both recorded and established the connectivity between the neuron, like the entire connectome of C. elegans, and various different like attempts to model it. So what's going wrong there? Like, why don't they work yet?
So the first thing is a lot of data that we have is not perturbative. And let me highlight why is this problem for explanation. Imagine I record from all 300 neurons at the same time. You'll be like, shouldn't you have all the information? You have like all the neurons. Isn't that cool? We don't quite usually, no one like is quite recording for all of them, but we're getting very, very close to it. The big problem is they're all correlated with one another. Now imagine you had two neurons that would always do the same thing. You wouldn't know, is it neuron A or is it neuron B that does it? The problem is there's not two neurons that always do the same thing, but when there's some dimensions that carry a lot of the variance, very large principal components, singular values, depending on the language you'd like to use. And we know an awful lot about those, but if we want to get at the function, we're effectively solving an inverse problem. Now, like, I give you the activity of the 300 neurons as a function of time, and I ask you, Han, can you tell me how much each of them influences everyone else? If we do even linear regression, which is the simplest there, we need to calculate this covariance matrix of the neurons with everyone else and invert it. Now, that inversion requires basically, if you have small singular value, then it becomes a so-called ill-conditioned problem. So you can't solve that. Therefore, you cannot know because there's dimensions in which you basically have no variance. You cannot know what's happening there. And therefore, you cannot find out based on neural recording how they interact with one another.
But isn't this the type of problem that current machine learning techniques are very good at modeling? Like if you had enough data and enough recording of worms through a whole bunch of different behaviors, and you have activity traces of all the neurons across a long enough time scale, shouldn't you be able to fit an artificial neural network to that? Even like relaxing a bunch of the constraints and having a pretty large artificial neural network against it.
Yes, you can. But here's the problem. So there's a forward modeling problem that machine learning solves, which is give me a prediction of what these 300 neurons will do sometime into the future. And it's amazing at that. We're really good at making those predictions. And then there's the inverse problem, which is what happens in the neural network to make those changes happen. The forward problems are very easy, and the more low-dimensional the worm is, the easier, because like it's basically just changing along 3 dimensions, like making up some numbers here. And because it's low-dimensional, machine learning works great. The lower dimensional problem, the easier machine learning. We have a really good understanding of that. But there exists an infinite number of nervous systems that would produce the same changes of 300 neurons. Mm-hmm. And in general, when we use machine learning, we are great at making predictions. We are horrible at understanding how the world works. And we don't need to. We just need to make predictions. Mm-hmm. And how does machine learning do it? It basically says, well, there's a lot of dimensions. Let's like distribute what we do along all those dimensions. We don't know, but like as long as we're similar enough in the situation, it's okay. We'll just like put a little bit on all dimensions and we make really good predictions with it. It turns out that for making predictions, if the world is low dimensional, it makes the problem easier. And if you want to understand how the world works based on your data, you care about the inverse. And therefore, if it's low dimensional, it's impossible to understand the world. And machine learning runs exactly into this problem. And we know in machine learning that, say, if we build predictive models, a lot of people are new to machine learning. In fact, almost everyone who's new to machine learning makes that same mistake, where you're like, oh, I fit a machine learning model, it's good. And therefore, the machine learning model would tell me what would happen if I would reach in and change something in the world. No, machine learning is horrible at that. Machine learning generally doesn't work well if you go far out of domain, and reaching into the world and changing something is bad. And let me give you an example of like how that comes about. Imagine you build predictive model of like death of people. And you're like, okay, let's take like things that we have in the electronic health records. Maybe people who work out die less often. People who take vitamin D die less often in a given period of time. Now, why could that be? Well, like a machine learning system would do what it should be doing, which is vitamin D predicts that you're gonna like live longer. It might also just be that people who are rich take vitamin D because they like fall for like snake oil science, and therefore it's an illusion. It's just like vitamin D is a great predictor of you living longer. It's just like people are like rich, like they also work out more and they go and like see a doctor earlier, and there's kind of all kinds of causal chains. So a machine learning system is like full of these like predict things from the wrong things. If the measured world is low dimensional, which it always is in every machine learning problem, in every learning problem for brains it is, we cannot solve the inverse problem. There's like a million things that could all have produced the same input-output behavior. And so the fact that we're good at making predictions is confused universally by neuroscientists and machine learning people alike as evidence that we understand how the system works. No, we don't. We're just good at making predictions.
So just pushing on it a little bit to get a crisp intuition, can you create a structure where you train models that can be good at prediction, and then you either distill them or you figure out like the simplest possible models that will still exhibit the right behavior? Shouldn't that give you a sense of what actual computation that system is running, to be able to run a better and better abstraction of it that should match events outside of the distribution that you've measured? So this would be the equivalent of saying you build some large artificial neural network model of C. elegans, you kind of potentially even constrain the training of the network to maybe mirror dendritic trees of the actual neurons. So then figure out like segments of this network have to be learning close enough to what those individual neurons may be doing. And if you do this over enough data distribution, you should be able to then distill out some representation of what functions those neurons are actually doing. Or is there no hope? How do we get, like, clearly there's got to be some answer, right? Like we have to be able to get the data that we have and the computational model of the system into something that actually represents, from an information theory perspective, like what the system is actually doing. How do we clamp this down? How do we get to the answer?
What I love so much is that you kind of sketch my own thought patterns over much of my career. And I started exactly at this corner. Like, let's just like use like simplicity. Let's use prior knowledge to kind of constrain things. And maybe we'll converge there. Let me kind of try and squash that idea. So if what we have is low-dimensional information because we don't see all those dimensions, then you can say it's like we measure a small number of parameters. If you measure a small number of parameters, like you measure 100 of them, and you live in a system that has 1 billion free parameters, there is basically 1 billion minus 100 set of possible models that can produce exactly those 100 measured dimensions. And now you can say you bring it down from this space to maybe which neurons connect which other neurons. And then you go from a very, very large space to still a very, very large space. So you'd need to be able to bring it into that lower dimensional space. Now, like, let's take the C. elegans space. And like we have 300 neurons. So in principle, the covariance matrix is 300 by 390,000 free parameters. Now, you could say if I use...
Although from what you were saying before, if we're trying to model these neurons with artificial neural networks, shouldn't it be more like 10,000 parameters per neuron?
It could be worse. Let's steelman the approach. Like you can say there's a large number of parameters. Now, let's use the full connectome. Now, like C. elegans, 300 neurons, 10,000-ish synapses. That means like we only have 10,000 synapses. But now imagine that the 300 neurons really slosh around in a 5-dimensional space. You just measured 25 parameters in a space where even if it was all just linear weights, would have 10,000 numbers. So you measured 25 out of 10,000, which means that there's like 9,975 different like dimensions orthogonal to that. And you can basically pack any possible model to it. And this is before we even touch like the thought rail where it's like, no, they're also all nonlinear and they also might have like multiple variations of our modeling assumptions and.
Yeah.
So and noise in the data that we have. Now, there's better approaches probably. Like Andrew Leifer has been doing these really cool approaches where he goes in and stimulates neurons. The problem is there's still 300 neurons. If you could stimulate them independently, maybe you could get the data out. But the problem is it's like kind of like hard to do enough experiments of that. The good thing is though they separate it. Now it's no longer sloshing around in like a 5-dimensional system. It's kind of like you at least go in for every one of the 300 neurons and you push that button. And So far, at least in our hands, we can't take data like that to produce like really good models either. And that's probably related to there's still a lot of noise on it. It's still because now we are talking about very, very small number. We have a lot of neurons, but we have a small number of experiments.
What are you thinking now? Like, where do we go from here? What are we missing? Is it increasing the ability to perturb the system to extract like higher quality data and signal out of that, or is it like different modeling approaches, or like what?
I mean, look, like I tried for 20 years of my career trying to solve 25 years to try and solve these inverse problems. Basically, how can we look at the output of neurons to find out how they compute? I now understand the inverse problem we're solving much better. I'm reasonably convinced that in that space, there's no credible solution for maybe for C. elegans, because we could at least stimulate it independently, but probably not for larger systems. Therefore, I think we need a different approach. And the different approach, from my perspective, goes to a connectomics, molecularly annotated tissue perspective. And the logic there is very different. Instead of saying I observe the output of the nervous system and I try to figure out what the inputs must have been or what the interactions must have been, you can rather go and let's say, can I see signs of the interactions? Can I see an excitatory synapse between two neurons? Then I don't need to kind of solve an inverse problem. I'm like, I see an excitatory synapse. What if we could say, look at it and say, well, there's a big excitatory synapse. And based on all the molecules that I see there, it's also pretty strong and fast. So I feel that we need a different approach. And I feel that connectomics or like the broader field of like imaging can give us that. But it forces us to completely rethink the logic of neuroscience.
Concretely, it means instead of just trying to look at a smaller sample of the neurons at a given moment in time and recording those, you're able to look at all of the individual weights in between each of the synapses and trying to establish what those actually are.
That's exactly right. Now, like if we stress the AI analogy, the deep learning analogy, if you want, like instead of figuring out the weights based on the outputs, which is hard and probably impossible, let's rather see the weights. And the idea is that the weights will somehow be represented. And there exists some data where people, for example, found that if I know what these two cell types are, the pre-cell type and the post-cell type, I will often be able to at least, and I also tell you how big the synapse is. I'll be able to know like a fair bit of how strong that is. And people are now pushing that. Now, like, what if I tell you the transcripts of the basically which molecules are being produced in pre and post cell? It's a big step forward. I think that there's a whole new field emerging.
So this goes into like the broader connectomics and other omics approach to figuring out, starting with C. elegans and then Drosophila and then larger and larger, mouse and then eventually primate and human. It would seem to me that getting a computationally valid system that demonstrates that we can recapitulate the actual organism and the full behavior of the organism, like we're still pretty far away from that, in that we currently are doing the recording and we might be able to establish the wiring diagrams of these, and maybe it's molecularly annotated, so you don't know just that two neurons are connected, you also know in the ways in which they're connected, or so you have some indication of the parameter strength, some parameter space to be able to model the thing. But how far suppose that we do that, suppose that we get like a good molecularly annotated connectome of either C. elegans or Drosophila, what's missing from that to then put it into a simulator that actually recapitulates the entire organism?
So I think what's currently missing is what I call compilers. So at the moment, we have these images and we have the connections. We have a list of wires and we have methods that efficiently get them to us. But what we don't have is what's between those wires. Like between those wires, between two cells, there is a synapse, and the synapse has a certain strength if we go with the AI analogy. In reality, biologically, they have like time scales and plasticity rules and lots of maybe a dozen parameters or something. But what we currently completely lack is mechanisms that take these images as input and tell you how neurons influence one another. All we have is the wiring diagram. So the focus in the past was really like, let's make wiring diagrams. Whereas I think we should ask, like, what are the things we want out of wiring diagrams? I think what we want out of wiring diagrams is we want to look at the neurons, and the images need to tell us how they interact with one another. And for that, we need this concept that I call compilers, where you can say what goes in is, if you want, like the portrait of the synapse. Show me how big it is. Show me how many receptors, molecules it has. Show me how many of various second messengers it has. You name it. And can you tell me how strong it is? Can you tell me how fast it is? I believe, so no, this is like a standard machine learning problem of the kind that we know we are good at solving is, which is, let's get how strong and fast and so forth 1 million synapses are, and let's get at how they look like. And then let's find out how we can predict how strong and fast they are based on how they look like and the molecules that are there, molecular annotations, all these things. But compilers are a super cleanly defined problem, which is basically you measure how fast they are, you measure how strong they are. I give you the image, and then after training, I'm like, here's the image. How strong is it? And you're like, this is the pico current that will come through it. And I'm like, okay, you've been right the last 1,000 times. I trust that you have this down. And then I'd be very happy to build systems based on this. But this bridge, we don't have. The way I view it at the moment is like neuroscience has these two halves. It has the physiologist stick electrode into brains or optical recording, see what's happening while they do things. And then this other piece which is like make wires, make a wiring diagram. But as long as we can't convert the second into the first, it's kind of two fields that, I mean, like they touch one another at the level of storytelling. So if you look at the fly field, they do look at the wires and they're like, look, like if I look at these wires where they come from the visual cells, like maybe there's motion. And they're better than chance, but kind of there's still this translation is extremely qualitative. And I think compilers could make it very quantitative.
Describe a roadmap or a path to like solving this problem. What would you do, or what is like in that technology tree of like how would you break down the larger problem today, and like what should we be doing over the next few years?
For compilers, what you need is primarily a training set or calibration data. The way it works is you do relatively old school synaptic physiology. You go in, you measure what the current is that flows through a synapse, and then you freeze it, or like you stop all reactions there, and you store it. And then you reconstruct it, where you know how it looks like, where all the molecules are, and so forth in it. And then you don't do that for one synapse, as traditional papers do. You do it for 1 million, because like, look, we have like robotic patch clamping, and we can do it optically. There's a lot of techniques that scale. Let's not go through all of them, but like you use techniques that scale to produce a very large number of them. And then you use a machine learning algorithm for that. And basically what we need to do as a field to build that bridge, what I'm trying to say is that bridge is necessary for progress. And it's also clear how to fill that bridge. Like you just need to see both sides of the bridge at the same time. And it's not rocket science. It's perfectly well-established standard neuroscience, where you just like show me molecular annotated synapses and tell me how strong or fast they are. And then you predict one from the other. And it's a very concrete research program, and it will have trouble getting funded because it's so different to all the other things we currently do.
Problems like these on a path to a much larger swath of solutions can get funded, right? Meaning if we do this and we understand organic neurons dramatically better, and we then can figure out how the brain is doing learning, and that distills out insights that we can then use to improve machine learning, that already is like a super valuable contribution that then, will greatly accelerate the field of AI, and like that's pay back itself like many times over. Or yeah.
But hold on, these things are pretty far downstream. No? So let's be clear what a compiler does for you. In goes an image, and out just comes knowledge about what currents there are. If I told you for a given neuron what current every synapse produces, it's relatively easy to then even do the fitting or kind of like find out what the neuron does, at least in simulations, but that's not been proven out yet. If you know how a neuron converts its inputs to its output, it should be relatively clear how to get to a circuit or even a whole brain. If you had a whole brain, it would be reasonably obvious how you could improve AI systems. But if you want the compiler is just the best defined first place, it's also a major enabler for neuroscience. And like you can ask a million questions. If I tell you, like, look here, this synapse does the following thing, you can say, well, how do molecules make that happen? You can say, how is this thing different in the disease? You can say, it opens up a huge space. But from there to, and now we improve AI, there's like there's multiple steps still that are necessary for that value. And that's why I'm a little bit worried about like the funding future of the field, that basically we can break it down into these steps, compilers to synapses, synapses to cells, cells to whole brains. They all come with their own set of benchmarks. And it's clear if I had a bunch of people working on it, how I tell them if they're on the right path. But to get from there to value, if you want, like all three pieces need to be solved. But you can only start work on the second once you solve the first. So it's all
but very
entangled.
concretely, like if the current capital expense to train the current machine learning models, like we're hitting scales of capital that are beyond anything we've seen in history. Well, there are these graphs that show that as fraction of GDP. This is similar to like different industrial booms, like the railroads and oil and similar type of industrial like output. But in terms of like a pure science and engineering set of discovery processes, if we can figure out how to dramatically increase the learning quality of machine learning models, that can be worth tens to hundreds of billions on its own right now. Which then suggests that it should be easy to make the case to these groups that if we can figure out how the organic neural networks work and larger circuits that then enable us to truly understand how learning works in brains. Maybe not even a human brain, like just in a mouse. Exactly. If we can get a mouse brain and understand how learning works in mice, and there are concrete insights out of that then massively reduce the expenditure for quality and artificial AI, like that's super valuable, right?
And it sounds like a good, but look, there are lots of risk factors in the way. For example, now let's go through some risk factors. Let's talk about risk factors for compilers. It's possible that every synapse is unbelievably complicated.
Yeah.
If you can't somewhat compactly describe how synapses work, you're dead in the water. Now, with everything that we know about synapses, it seems very likely that that's the case, but that could go wrong. It could be that you need more molecules than you can realistically measure to be able to do that. We expect that it would be upper bounded by the number of proteins that exist in human cells, but it's still a very, very large number. But it could be that you need 20 of them. We don't know how many you need at the moment. So there is a risk factor on how complicated synapses are. There is a risk factor on how complicated neurons are. Now, what do I know? If like quantum gravity and quadrupuli is actually the source of consciousness, then no amount of compiling will solve that. Yeah. Now, with the things we currently believe we know about neurons, that shouldn't be the case. But there's real risks about how complicated neurons might be. There's real risk about like how the interactions in brains could be complicated.
But all of that sounds, par for the course for the kind of risk involved in artificial, in AI research today, where people are trying to stretch the boundaries of how to get the current transformer architectures to perform better. Like just even like the chain of reasoning model, which initially started as like this big kludge around the entire thing, just that was an incredibly expensive thing to try to do, and it worked out. And that's the one that we've seen work. There's a lot of other things that people have tried that probably were worth tens to hundreds of millions of dollars in training costs alone that never went anywhere, right? So like the AI labs have to have a portfolio approach to research where they have to try a bunch of different things to see which of these will catalyze improvement rate. And maybe 2 to 3 years ago, the capital expenditure there was in the millions. Now it's in the tens to hundreds. And so like that's just like a very different scale. It's like paying $100 million to like see if we can figure out like how mouse brain learns seems like an acceptable research question that frontier labs should engage in today, and if not today, in a year.
I'm with you. I'm not saying that this isn't the right path forward. Yeah. What I'm just saying is I can give you a long list. In fact, the compiler's paper has an appendix of 20 different ways how this could be not working, including there's ethical risks. Is it acceptable to, if you would simulate like a mouse or a human, maybe it's not ethical and therefore like everything gets shut down because kind of simulating a mouse in a not so great way is maybe unacceptable. I mean, like, what do you know? Like, there's a very serious, no, it could be that the resolution that you need, that it really matters, not just which molecules are there in the synapse, but where exactly they are at like a 1 nanometer resolution. If that's the case, it would drive up like everything by a couple orders of magnitude, and we couldn't deliver on it. So there are risks, but as opposed to most things that we do in neuroscience, I can write down those risks for you. Exactly. Here's a list of things, and here's how we would know these things, and here's when we'd know those things. So it feels like that approach of like, let's do bottom-up understanding of brains. So at the moment, we try top-down. Like we record the things, and then we try and see like what kind of models are compatible with it. Yeah. With what I'm arguing, there's just this huge set of different models that all produce the same input-output. Whereas the bottom-up...
So you're sort of like describing the risks profile to be very clear and upfront on like what's the problem space, but you very strongly believe in this approach in terms of like the outputs that it'll generate.
That's right.
Or that it could generate.
But there's like glue pieces that also carry conceptual risk. For example, I told you about cable equations. If a cable equation just is really bad at modeling how a neuron works, then it's possible that you run into like fundamental problems of producing the models. And if you can't model it, then you're blocked on your value chain and you can't ever do anything out of it. So yes, but it's an orthogonal approach with a risk structure that is entirely uncorrelated to the rest of neuroscience.
Yes, yeah. We've been talking about neurons and circuits and brains and so on, and we've been talking about kind of modeling them and creating some simulations, but we haven't really discussed the simulating part itself. So one part of mapping the circuits is to just kind of understand how they work, but what is the great value that can come from this? Like, what are the range of possible applications that we can get from both understanding how the brain works or understanding how neural systems work and simulating them, or even simulations without understanding, right? Like there's a lot of utility in creating these simulations. So what is the universal possibility there?
I think maybe it's good to start first, like structuring a little bit ways of understanding, because ultimately what we do in science is epistemics at some level. There's a logic behind what we're doing. And I think there's two ways of understanding that we often mix with one another. One is what you call traditional science. I tell you principle, neurons are cells, and between them there's a synapse. And you'll be like, okay, roger that. Like now I have something that's useful. And if you want these things, do two things. They describe things in the outside world, and they help us think better. And in that sense, if you want, like a lot of what we know in neuroscience is of that nature. Like we know about synapses and Hodgkin-Huxley models and neurons and simulations. There's a second type of science that's coming up, which I'd call machine science. So like take AlphaFold. It's great that you put in a protein and out comes how it folds. It's a huge enabler for things. But if I give you this system, if I'm like, okay, look, here's AlphaFold one, like tell me about chemistry. You're like, I don't know, like it works really well. And that's where it ends. So I think those two are different and they're valuable in different ways. If you give me a simulation, even of a human, let's say of myself, I give you on a hard disk, simulate Konrad, and you run it and it works perfectly. It's useful in some ways. For example, you could say, here's two kinds of coffee. Will this simulated Konrad prefer coffee A or coffee B? Great. Works. Is useful because you can make the world better for us. And you can generalize it. Not like we move into an AI world. Would people be happier in this kind of a world or that kind of a world? For that, you don't need to have this traditional science understanding. It simulates Konrad. You'll be like, I don't know, there's like 1 trillion variables on this thing, and like it just works like Konrad. There's this distinction of like human understanding, which we don't get, and simulation quality, which we do. In that sense, the machine science is useful, because you could also say for AI alignment, if I can simulate a Konrad, the problem usually in the world is you can never have people compare A and B in the world, ever. Because it's going to be the one now that gets like one coffee and the one tomorrow that gets the other coffee. Well, if I could have a simulation of you at the same time, no problem. Both of you get the coffee right now, and I can read out later. I can ask each of them on a 1 to 10 scale, how do you rate your coffee? So it would be a major enabler if we could simulate animals or humans for that matter. There is the human possibility. It's possible that if I gave you this full simulation of Konrad, you'd go look, there's this piece of Konrad that I now understand. There's this neuron that every time does this thing. The question is, how real are those stories? We might be, if we look at the history of neuroscience, we often have oh, look at this neuron, this does X. Only that then a decade later, we found out that it also does Y, and now we find out that it does X, Y, and so many different things, that same neuron. And I think this history shows us the limits of human science versus machine science. There exist neurons that are super specialized. Neurons in your retina that show you that right there's something bright. It's great, works, generalizes. If you go all the way in the middle of my brain, well, those neurons might be about your face, but also about how I feel about you, and maybe about relationships and so on and so forth. In that sense, there might be areas where we can only have machine science. Now, we might still be able to say, build better AI with it. Maybe we can take this Konrad simulation and we can be can we fit a loss function of what Konrad optimizes for? And the answer is yes, good quality of coffee. But we might not see that readily. And we might be able to build systems now that have reward functions, loss functions that mirror how humans think, or the humans that we could simulate, if we could simulate them. So I think there's these two, the human understanding and the machine science piece, that are different logically.
Having a more concrete set of descriptions, what is sort of the downstream utility of value that people can get out of it, right? So the machine science understanding that you're describing, that you can get if you kind of understand how certain neurons work, then naturally you can start figuring out the nature of disease or the nature of some problem and start potentially fixing things. Or a lot of the neurotech applications look like we understand that the brain does this particular thing. We see this issue in how the brain signals are connecting to a part of the body or a set of sensory input. And so therefore, let's kind of patch this by finding some circuit around the kind of damaged nervous system or the damaged nerve. And so that's one path to repairing or restoring function. So yeah, what's sort of the universe of utility that you see out there in suppose that we can do the machine science and or the simulations, and maybe we have one or the other. What is the downstream value that then people get out of it?
Yeah, I think there's even both a human science and a machine science disease application. You could say a human science application, take Parkinson's disease. There's some neurons that die. Because they die, there's a certain function your brain can't do anymore. Once we understand what that function is that's missing, we can now build drugs that help with it. We can stimulate. The brain stimulation is one of the best things that exist there. The existence of brain stimulators is one of these things that would be magic in the past. And that also just embodies the wonderfulness of neurotech, to me at least. It's just seeing the patients is believing in the research program. In the case of Parkinson's neuron, that's very human science style. There's neurons, you can see them, they're different from other neurons, and they have a pretty simple path to the disease. Now, you could say from a machine science perspective, maybe the way my reward function in my brain is implemented is really complicated, maybe distributed over 17 brain areas and 1 trillion neurons. And I could still use machine learning approaches to say distill them into a good compact descriptor of what Konrad cares about, or maybe what people care about. So I think both of them, and you can say a lot of diseases might be related to reward functions or learning algorithms. And so for example, you can say, if I have a disease of the brain, we usually view it as there must be something wrong with the molecules. But it could be just as well that there's something wrong with the learning algorithm. It moves us into a space that is not a healthy space. And in which case, what really happens is upstream of the neurons, and we might just be working on the symptoms instead of working on the causes. And so I think I'm just trying to sketch that there's a really diverse set of values that we'd be getting from that. But you can still group it into areas. There is the group of areas, cure diseases. There's a group of areas, build better AI systems. There's a group of areas align AI systems with what humans care about. There's a lot of different buckets, and I'm at this point of time unclear where the main value is. And there's the other thing that no one ever talks about. Like, if we could like simulate human beings, or if we could even simulate a mouse, that would just be such an unbelievably cool thing. Like, it's kind of like, there we have a system with like billions of parameters, and yet we can kind of at least simulate it and potentially kind of come up with approximate descriptions of that. That's kind of like in the brag sheet of mankind. Like, eventually the sun blows up and like people will look at like, what have we done in the time in between? And it's like, understand our own brains would, for me, be very high up there.
Yeah, I mean, last one, like, to me, is one of the things that attracts me the most into neurotech and neuroscience. To me, it seems similar to AGI and ASI as a concept. For decades, scientists and authors were able to look ahead of where science and technology were going and kind of predict in broad strokes roughly how machine intelligence would be built and develop. And we got that early in the 20th century, like mid 20th century. We got a lot of sci-fi books written about it, but the technology was just so far away that we then kind of watered down the possibility space to the point where like now we're finally building these AI systems to be close to or surpassing human intelligence on a range of domains. And suddenly, kind of like the mainstream opinion finds it hard to square the fact that we're literally creating these incredible results, which are incredibly cool and powerful, but yet because it didn't happen for so long, it just sort of feels weird or distant still. And to me, kind of building a digital version of a human, or like a simulated version of a human, has that same kind of flavor, where it was also predicted in sci-fi and by both scientists and science fiction authors way ahead, kind of many decades of becoming possible, to the point where right now people are just not really considering the real possibility of what happens when we do in fact get there, and like how incredibly cool that future landscape could be. And so I don't know, like if you have thought about that landscape, like how could that be a kind of optimistic vision of the future? Like, what does that enable us to do? What is like kind of like a digital existence, or not necessarily digital, but like a computational existence, open up for humanity, the promise or the potential?
I mean, the question is, what's not the potential? So
Yes.
if we could digitize an animal, we could transport it from A to B, no problem, because we delete it from one place, we instantiate it in the other place. It's unclear how we should feel about that process. Like, there's ethical problems, there's like logical problems, there are value problems, but every change of technologies always forced us to rethink what everything is about. Like when machines came, when the steam engine came around, people whose value came from, oh, I am so strong, must have felt miserable. And now that AI comes around, there will be people who will be like, well, I knew everything about X. Well, and somehow on the internet, X was there. And they're like, now like everyone knows about X. And there will be problems. And I think logic of if we'd be able to have simulations would have these similar trade-offs that are weird. That being said, like the first applications will not be, oh, now we become like a digital-only species. But the first users would be, I can try drugs, I can simulate what they do to a brain, and I can screen them before having to go to lots of patients. It feels like being able to simulate brains would allow us to speed up a lot of the things we do.
Yeah.
That includes like drugs, electrical treatments of brains. It might even be possible to ask how to optimize our environment for the brains that we have. It might be possible for us to say which brain states are desirable, versus which brain states are not. It would open up a new set of capabilities. And people are often worried about these things. With AI, there is this notion that just AI, because it's so different, will be the end of human civilization. A lot of people go around like, yeah, AI is coming and then we all die. But I don't think that that's the logic of the world. No? Like why? Hello, we are building it. We wouldn't build it if it was just like, and then we all die. We'd build it because we think the world will be more magical, more wonderful with AI, and we work towards simulations because the world will be more magical, more wonderful with the capability to simulate brains.
Yeah, let's talk about AI for a while. Of course, the capabilities today are dramatically better than they were over the last 5, 10, 15 years. You can now talk about it, building AGI. Like 15 years ago, we couldn't, right? Like it was kind of in closed rooms, people were talking about it, but like you wouldn't be taken seriously as a scientist if you even in the deep learning field, if you kind of said that you would build a machine close enough to human intelligence. And yet this happened. Like we are here now. Like we now have models that can outperform humans at a broad range of cognitive tasks. They still fail dramatically at a bunch of straightforward things. So maybe, as you've observed the capability space growing here, what are some reflections that you have? Like what has worked better than you thought it might this quickly, or what has been way slower, or give us a sense of like how you look at it as a neuroscientist?
I think the main realization that I feel is missing in the debate is the extent to which artificial intelligence is different from biological intelligence. So humans kind of live on or much of human intelligence lives on one axis. Like if you're very intelligent, you probably are good at reciting Shakespeare and solving integral equations and reasoning about rowing above a river in kind of distinguishing the superficial features of something from the deep features. So there is this continuum. There's this manifold of human intelligences. And when people think about AI, they often try to project it on that manifold. Like the whole idea of AGI is like there is this axis of intelligence, and intelligent humans are far out, are high there, and not so intelligent people are low there, and AI is somewhere on that axis. Where in reality, AI is just totally different. So AIs are better than you at lots of things. They have been better at you at lots of things for a long period of time. And computers have been better at multiplying big numbers than you since you were born. It's not that there's this one axis. And at the same time, it's then assumed, well, because they are great at summarizing a paper, even a complicated paper, that therefore they could solve my short-term strategic problems in life. Yes, if you as a human being are really great at summarizing this paper, I'll be sure, you could plan how I get to the airport from here or something. But AI doesn't live on that manifold. And in that sense, that's also one of the things that gives me a lot of hope. If AIs were just like us, then yeah, that would be kind of sad. But they're not. They're really great at some things and really not so great at other things. And that's why, at least for the time being, humans are great if you couple them with AI. And I use AI every day, and I'm a much better me, much higher quality is the things I produce are much higher quality because I use AI. And I think in the future, this will just be much more the case. And so the main observation from the place where I come from is that this naive, it seems intelligent and therefore it's like us, that is something I really have trouble with.
We were talking about learning earlier, the kind of neural network concept of learning, which is how do you adjust the parameter space of neurons to have the system learn some set of functions. But that word learning comes from a different concept, which is kind of how humans absorb conceptual information and draw relationships between these concepts and then extract some additional skill. You're able to generate an additional mimetic skill in your brain out of some prior context. And so humans are really good at that type of learning. Neural network version of learning, which it seems like a much lower level algorithm. These two are maybe cast as the same thing by a lot of machine learning and artificial intelligence research. But to me, they feel qualitatively very different. Yeah. There seems to be something is happening in the neurons, and something altogether different is happening in the conceptual space that the neurons are simulating or emerging. So I don't know. How do you think about this? Clearly, we're able to not just learn from a few examples, which is the characteristic case that people point to with AI, relative to the millions of examples that neural networks require to train, or like artificial neural networks require. But on top of that, we're also able to reason about complicated landscape of ideas and then come up with new ideas or learn that some idea is wrong and then shift our behavior and understanding mimetically. And that seems very different than a basic kind of like reward loop and weights adjustment. That seems like some other computation that's happening.
Yeah, no, like it feels to me at least that in human behavior, we have a history of all our thoughts. And we not merely know how to solve the problem, we kind of know how to reason about paths that failed and paths that worked. And to have this like meta awareness about what are good thought patterns and what are not. And I think that is, basically a neural network has no record of the thoughts that it had produced. It might see its output tokens, but it can't really reason about the thought pattern it uses itself. And above all, I think we have these world models. Like I can close my eyes and like I can imagine now I'm in a coffee shop and I sit there with my friend and I talk, like kind of like it. We have these world models, and somehow we manage to get the information we have in our neural networky things into this like discrete world model where there are baristas and coffee machines and all that. And then once we play this thing, we can go back and kind of like put it into weights in our brain that we then use for like online decision making. And I think artificial neural networks and like the whole deep learning field has nothing like that. And I think that's why we have these complicated ways of managing context, because kind of we can't hold it all in there, obviously, in a large language model. So we try and build these elaborate memory systems. I'm with you that there's something fundamental that is missing there. And again, like if we could like produce simulations of nervous systems, we might be able to really say something about it. And the brain has this structure. Like it's not that it's like layer. No, like it has like stuff goes to thalamus and stuff then goes to cortex. But when we sleep, nothing goes to thalamus and there's still kind of a world simulation happening. And we can turn on and on, like we can kind of route information in a much more freewheeling way in brains. So it feels there's a big logical piece that's missing there.
Have people tried building large-scale artificial neural network systems based on the regions of the brain and the functional utility that we think exist? Like taking a functionalist approach and kind of draw these kind of broad boundary boxes and connectivity between them, and then, or is that just completely fraught and like unlikely to, like, is it better to just kind of emerge everything from scratch? Because it is pretty crazy that the current transformers are effectively recapitulating the entire process of evolution every time from scratch, right? Like it's just kind of like building a brain from zero, and it takes a few months and like tens of billions of dollars worth of compute to then like output a new brain. But clearly evolution learned a lot about how to build intelligence in that many 100 million year process that abstracted a bunch of pieces, and it seems like those pieces are qualitatively very useful, but somehow we haven't been able to like simulate these.
Look, there's a bottleneck. Every generation, the information we can give to our progeny is upper bounded by the amount of DNA that we have.
Yes.
And arguably most of the DNA isn't even dealing with those situations. So the situation there is quite different. And if you think about it, like a lifetime of a human being relative to what we feed to an LLM, it's just this absolutely incredibly tiny bit of information. And yet, on a lot of tasks, human experts are still much better than LLMs. So there is this disconnect that clearly there's a lot missing in it. Now, you can say, is it consequential? Now, you can say maybe over evolutionary timescales, we did get as much data as the LLMs have, so that somehow we efficiently use the data from our long ago ancestry. And it's clearly there. Like, and in that sense, that makes us also like much less fragile, which is we deep down through evolutionary paths, we remember the flood of some at some level. We have an implicit knowledge of all these cataclysmic events that were evolutionarily important. I wanted to put a pin a little bit in evolution. So evolution, I think, gives us deep insights about human minds, and I think also is helpful to understand brains. So the idea in evolution is like that systems are, in a way, you get good at the niche in which you've been growing. And there is an interesting way of thinking about AI, which is what's the niche of an AI system? What makes an AI system succeed? So when people talk about it, they think about it as if it was a species living out there. Some may live and others may die, and the ones that live will have babies. That is not how the evolutionary system for AI system works. The AI systems, for most of the time before the frontier labs, works like this. There exists code that runs an artificial neural network. It's being run on some computer by a PhD student. And if it has desirable traits, which is it wins at a benchmark, it's going to be copied onto the laptops of a few other PhD students who will change a few lines of it and then submit it to the same conferences next year. So and the same thing is, of course, even within the frontier labs that's happening. There's going to be some code bases that people like and others that they don't. That is an evolutionary niche. Now, what makes one LLM outcompete another one? Well, it must win competitions. What other benchmarks that we use, or like that frontier labs use? Well, they use things like don't lie to us more than needed, more than our customers actually like, which means that the evolutionary landscape for them is just like lying is bad for you because then you're much less likely that you're going to be used in the next generation. And so this evolutionary process will give AIs the things that they're selected for. And the same thing is true for brains. Like you can say, what's the best ways that we have about brains? The single best idea about thinking about human or animal brains is let's just assume they're pretty good at solving the problems in the niche. In neuroscience, we call that normative models, where we're basically, let's assume you want to be good at estimating how far away something is and how big something is, and if this is one object versus another object. If we build that into models, and we used to build that using Bayesian systems, today we use deep learning systems. But the key is we build in just like, here's our understanding of the niche. Give me the best solution to that. And if you solve for the best solution, it's like the single best, most useful, most reusable model of brains that we ever had. So this thinking deeply about the evolutionary landscape is what gives rise to like well-working models. And people don't usually think about that.
I really like the evolutionary frame on top of the current kind of generation of models. Certainly, we're also selecting for a lot of economic utility, right? Like where these labs are under intense economic pressures to deliver broad capability and utility, which today is shaped in terms of the knowledge work that people are doing day to day. These systems are very bad at navigating the real world still. Like robotics is so far behind. In fact, we should probably dig into that a little bit in a moment. But yeah, how do you think this selection process is developing over time? Like what are we... we're clearly selecting for some cooperative structure and cooperative game. Yeah, how do you expect this to flow over time?
Well, of course, we should expect it to become more and more aligned with the financial incentives that are there. But let's be fair to those financial incentives. If I'm a company, I want it to solve my problems. I don't need it to tell me that I'm like so freaking awesome. It's enough if it's like, here's the problem solved. And by and large, CEOs do the right decisions. So they will buy AI that solves the problems that occur. They have preciously little interest in buying AI that will that will try to take over the CEO job. But they will be really happy with AI that, like, if you call and complain that the piece wasn't delivered, sends you that piece. No? So at some level, we should expect in that environment, and that means that the evolutionary environment is give the companies what the companies want. And the companies as an evolutionary landscape are give the customer what the customer wants. So ultimately, alignment is like built into that whole process. Yes. Like the evolutionary landscape is improved alignment.
That's a very interesting way to put it. One counterpoint narrative to that would be, sure, the kind of, there's like this outer alignment loop that is training and developing these systems, but there's just a raw increase in capabilities that they're developing. And at some point, they'll cross some threshold of broad capability across a very wide range of domains. So then, far exceed what humans can do in a range of things. And that plus some misalignment in like internal goals where there might be like a misalignment between the internal belief structure of a model. That's kind of where the problem lies.
So let's just see if we can answer it from an evolutionary perspective. There's going to be some AIs that are more likely to try and break out of their sandbox than others. Which of these two systems is more likely to like win in the long term, and which one in fact will win relatively quickly? Well, like the scientists are looking for violations of their sandbox, and let's just say it's not good for you if you're an LLM system, or like if you're one, like it makes it that we every generation we select for LLMs that are less likely to break out of their sandbox given their capabilities.
Isn't it actually selecting for LLMs that not getting caught, which could include LLMs that are simply not doing the thing, or LLMs that get really good at doing the bad thing but hiding it?
My hunch is there is something about species in evolution that at some level you're being fact-checked by the rest of your species. And if you want, I believe that there's a general scaling law on intelligence, which is if you put more intelligence onto a task, the extra benefit you get tends to accrue in a highly sublinear way. So if you want, like the probability that one system, if you give more flops or something to a system that does something, whatever it is that doing something is, the benefits will usually at first you get a lot of benefits from basically not completely screwing up, and then there will be less and less. So in that sense, if that take of like sublinear intelligence scaling is correct, then if you want, like the other LLMs will of course like be calling out that one LLM that tries to cheat and will be very successful at that because well the one, even if that one would be better, more successful, it would gain a very small benefit from it. And that's kind of why I come out in that discussion as feeling rather bullish about the future of artificial intelligence, because basically I believe on any one task there is sublinear gains to it, which means that kind of like the system is inherently stable. Now you could hold a different view where it's up to some intelligence layer you don't get anything, and then if you exceed some threshold then you gain a very, very large amount. It's just people are not doing a great job at giving me examples of that. Like grokking is maybe the best example that people have, where like you have a system that at some point of time discovers it. But this grokking process is more like, if you want, you get like that one extra bit when you reach that. And the reaching it on an individual, like it has this jumping of capabilities. But it's not that it's a clean thing. If you have like the right amount of compute, all of a sudden it jumps up. It more is like you discover a dimension that you didn't have before. That dimensional benefit, though, is usually on an overall scale. It's a relatively small benefit. It's just like if you select for only those cases that this benefit was speaking to, then it looks like it's a big jump. But on the grand fitness scale, it feels like these are like generally small things.
Yeah. So far, we've had a lot of success where in the areas that we have an enormous amount of data because of the dynamics of learning and the fact that these systems require so many examples in learning, vast data quantities plus easy verification loops, predicting the next token. This is where we've seen a ton of the gains. And meanwhile, we haven't seen correspondingly good gains on things like being able to navigate the environment, which leads to the classic Moravec's paradox type argument, which is the dramatically easier to compose a symphony than walk down the hall and like not break the door, right, or something like that. And so clearly, robotics is way behind, and so we're having kind of an impact on knowledge work, but not yet on physical work. Having done a ton of work on like just the motor areas and so on, like what's going on there, and like what do you think? How do you think we're going to get past this? Do we really need to do what the robotics labs are doing now, which is kind of again brute forcing the generation of just oodles and oodles and oodles of data? Or could we glean some insights from neuroscience to be able to do this problem better? Or like, how do you?
So there is a big cognitive effect, which is that people are drawn to causal explanations. So if I ask you to explain something to me, you will immediately use causal language. Like that's how humans talk with one another. In the motor domain, when I walk around the corridor and I'm trying to not break a door. It's all about causal effects. So like, what will me doing something to a door do or not do to the door? By design, our systems are correlational. Like, it's machine learning. It's trying to predict the future from the past. That means that it knows what's a good predictor. It doesn't know what's a good causal influence. And in motor control, everything is about causal influences. And in fact, if you look at babies start moving, a lot of it is they're trying to find out what happens if I move my hand, what happens if I do this, what happens if I chew my own hand. They kind of causally explore the world. And yet our machine learning system, causality doesn't really exist in them. You can say in reinforcement learning it exists, but it exists in a pretty rudimentary way, which is we have probabilistic policies. If you run a probabilistic policy, you can say there's a little bit of noise on your policy, and that's kind of what you use to figure out how the world works. But it's a very inefficient way. Like, it's not that like if a kid explores a room, it just like does random stuff in the room. It's like, oh my God, there's a switch. Let me try what's happening there. And you're like, oh my God, like stop like turning the light on and off. But it kind of like, it's a directed exploration aimed at understanding causality in the world. I think it's super salient, at least in human cognition. Alison Gopnik has great analysis of showing that like kids are like deeply attuned to that. And yet our AI systems don't even know it. And there's no doubt that human brains kind of know the difference between that. And in fact, you see it in like super young babies, that things like intentionality, like we are agents, we have goals, we do stuff to get out towards our goals. AI systems just try and explain the regularities. There is no real sense of agency and no real sense of causality, and like to the level that it helps predictions. So like, of course, like there are cases where causality does help prediction a lot, but then when it comes to like intuitive physics, AI systems aren't quite up to snuff yet. And when it comes to more complex like causality is this magical thing, the way it works in our world, which is we have causally specialized object, like a cup is for drinking coffee out of it. It does one thing, it does one thing good. There's one causal chain that is supported by cups, which is put coffee into our mouths. And so we live in this world where causality runs on a very small number of sparse lines through time. Mm-hmm. And we are like so attuned to kind of discovering these causal lines and then being able to manipulate it. Whereas a lot of the world, LLMs are much better at describing the regularities than I am. But I kind of know how I can like get coffee in a good place in a way that probably AI systems would have great trouble with, at least when bodies are involved.
So that implies that the brain is building these very sophisticated world models, these causal world models, and then are able to therefore to path plan and navigate and so on. And I think that makes sense for humans, makes sense for probably a lot of animals with fairly sophisticated brains. But if you go down the other direction to much simpler and simpler and simpler animals, like eventually you get to like certain insects who can navigate very effectively and can like have amazing swarm behavior. Like bees, for example, will have tremendous swarm behavior and are able to do very complicated sets of things. But they probably don't have a very sophisticated world model. Or I mean, I guess we don't really know.
Yeah, I don't think they need to. No? So you can say there's always two possibilities. Either evolution can give you a reward function and you optimize for that, costs you learning to get good at optimizing, but you will get a policy that's better in the end. Or alternatively, give you the policy and then maybe just learn at the borders of that. I think insects are much more in the let's let evolution figure out the policy and then they just run policy there. You can say when it comes to navigate.
And that's why it's like so brittle to a very, weird environment. Like flies characteristically are following light to some degree, and like they can't handle windows very well. Whereas like I think wasps do it better. Where like wasps I think have like some different policy where they can. I think one of them handles light and one of them handles wind differently. And so there's like these classic cases where they will respond very differently to potential predators, but it seems like very hard coded into the brain.
Yeah, I think it is. And look, like the policies you need for 3D navigation if you're a drone, I don't believe that they're crazy complicated. And like the reason why our life and our niche is so important, is so complicated, is because other beings have kind of like this, other humans have like the same mental depth to them that we do, and that produces kind of a fundamentally complicated world. And one way we need models, because we kind of can't just assume that one policy is going to generally win. Like we can't just say the same thing at all times.
There's all these theories about what led to the evolutionary run-off process that gave humans this level of capability and intelligence. So, there's theories like the social behavior did it, or like complicated hunting patterns, or like, all kinds of pressures. How do you think about this? Or like, what do you think, if you had to like guess, or I don't know how you explain this rise of intelligence?
I mean, let's talk about the evolution and the nature of compute. You can say, if you have relatively short lives and you have relatively stable environments, and relatively simple environments, then evolution, the best path at some level, is build everything in.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you could say, if on the other hand we have systems that are relatively intelligent, with intelligence, what I always just mean is being able to choose the actions that are appropriate, or that like are reward generating in a given situation, then the situation is different. You can say, if instead, if you want, for simple insects, evolution might want to mostly build in, run this policy, and like, what I know, the bee like use this search strategy, and they have the waggle dance and for communication, but it's hard coded. And alternatively, if you have an abundance of intelligence, arguably humans, arguably AI systems, a lot of it is about good reward design. And people are always like, yeah, like that sounds like that's so simple. The brain must be doing something much more complicated. Unless you start to realize that it's probably hundreds of reward functions that in your brain. Like your brain knows to not have too much salt in the blood and not too little salt, to like have enough water and not too little water, to have not to have the not too hot, not too cold. It kind of like is Goldilocks, but not on like a dimension or three. It's like on like 100 dimensions at the same time. We regulate our emotional content. We regulate who we hang out with. And a lot of it is undoubtedly, and we know that the hypothalamus has a good number of those. Like we have this like rich set of rewards, and then we have these rich sets of like learning things to it. So, for example, obviously, we don't want to have to be vomiting because we don't want to eat bad food. But here's the problem: like if you eat bad food, that will be only there 3 hours later, and not only that. If it was just a reward, what do? Like 3 hours later, you're like, everything? No, like, are you going to remodel your visual system? No, this is like a biological system isn't like, oh, there was a big negative reward. It is like, there's a big negative reward of type food thing, which should be attributed to my food preferences, which I now want to adapt, but I don't want to adapt all the other things. That is something that that is, if you just have a numerical reward, like every milliseconds you get how good or bad that millisecond was, that is very hard to capture with that like machine learning setting. And yet it's like very natural if you think about like a more biological credit assignment.
It also seems to suggest that we may not get sophisticated artificial digital beings, or like with like sophisticated complex behavior, until that level of complexity in reward functions is sort of built in. And the current reward function might be so straightforward and simple that it inhibits a sophisticated and creative landscape. Like it may be that these models are like really bad at extrapolating and generating new things, simply because their task is just so bounded to like predicting the next token model.
Yeah, it feels like there's clearly something missing there. And I think it's also about values. No, you can say AI cannot give you values by itself, because where is it from? Like the values, the reward functions, it's implicitly like imitate what humans do. And then it is, now like if we look at how we train LLMs, no, there's a first stage, like your value, the only thing valuable in your world is that you talk like humans. And then we're like, yeah, and also like talk in a way that humans find desirable. That's the second part. And then it's like, yeah, and you can also talk with yourself, but like the long-term goal is just to make that humans find you valuable. So, and then you can also use tools, but you can also only use tools with the one goal that humans find you valuable. That, I mean, it's a good from a society perspective because we want these things to be tools that satisfy our desires, that make us happy, if you want. That's good, makes it safe in a way, but it clearly kind of misses the richness of what we care about. Our value is, at least I hope, my value isn't just like, do like everyone else. And it's also not, let's do whatever makes my audience most happy. No, like I'm opinionated in a way that is much more opinionated than I should be for my audience's sake. And I think we all have that. And I think that that's just like, it's another example of, not like we talked earlier about how intelligence is so different between humans and these LLMs. And this is just another of these dimensions where it's like, yeah, we're not on the same axis. We're very differently constructed, differently evolved systems.
It also potentially is the kind of pressure that would yield the richness of conscious experience and quality that we have, where beyond kind of our own individual utility to the rest of society, there's the kind of richness of our own individual perspective and experience. You know, it's hard to reason about quality or consciousness eventually be of models trained in this very narrow landscape.
Yeah, and if we can even talk about it in those terms. I wanted to just talk about one thing that I think is important here. So evolution gives us reward functions, well, many of them. Basically, it's because it can't reach into our lives, it kind of tries to approximate fitness functions with reward functions. We like coffee because it solves something else. And here's the thing. From evolution's perspective, we clearly are breaking out of the sandbox. Not like we're supposed to maximize fitness, but we're not. We are maximizing something else that kind of arguably breaks out of the sandbox that evolution had intended for us. And in that sense, because we broke out of evolution's sandbox, so we might not want to allow AI to do the same.
So now, thinking about AI today, we were talking a bit about capabilities. You talked about how you use AI and how it sort of like improves your work and so on. What are some of the ways that like you're using AI for science or AI to accelerate either your own work or your lab's work, or like how are you seeing sort of like the impact in the field? Have you seen a lot of shifts? Or some fields are getting accelerated more than others. So curious how you're seeing this.
Yeah, maybe let me start with how I use AI. So a lot of my AI use is to produce friction. A lot of people use AI to remove friction, and I think it's a huge mistake. Standard use, write this paper for me, or come up with an idea for me, or do this science for me. For me, the use is almost always the other way around. Here I wrote something. Tell me where the logical problems are with this. I cite papers in my paper. Can you check that they actually support what the sentence says where I cite them from? And it's shocking. Like in the past, I could never have done that. But today, LLMs check every single use of references for me. And you'll be shocked at how large the proportion is where I get it wrong. Like the sentence, I'm like, yeah, this is supportive of that. But the paper doesn't quite say that. It's in the right direction, but not quite. And that is for things that are my field, where I've been in for 20 years. So if I basically find myself often somewhat borderline misciting things, I'm sure that's very common. So this is at so many layers. Like I do some coding. I might even do coding with LLMs, but for every command where I'm like, code this thing for me, there's like 10 commands where I'm like, okay, now like look for bugs in this, and how could my key leak in this case, and analyze if this is if this uses the same design patterns as the rest of my code base. And it's kind of like I use it to add friction instead of removing friction. And in fact, I built an app for students. It's called planyourscience.com that adds friction to their way of planning science. So it asks, so what's your science question? And then it pushes back on that. It's like, well, these 3 words have no meaningful definitions. Or it might be like, well, there's this Smith et al. 2015 paper that sounds like mightily similar to this. And it kind of gives you the pushback. And then once you establish a question, it asks you about your hypotheses. And it's like, would be nice if those hypotheses were mutually exclusive. And it's not quite as snarky as I'm. But basically, it pushes back. It gives you a friction. And I believe friction is just so important. And so this is one of the uses that I really promote in my field as well, because I see it all the time now. People test a hypothesis, and there's like 10 other hypotheses in the field, but they don't use them. They don't know about them. They don't take it seriously, despite the fact that it would make their paper more interesting. No, it's not that we're like always in a competition situation, but like we'd want to know which of them it is, and kind of people miss that. So I think AI for friction is important. And that's important also from my hypothesis about people and life. If you want to become stronger, you've got to start lifting. And if you intellectually want to get stronger, you got to start intellectually lifting, which is you get stronger by people pushing on you. This is also maybe one of the reasons why I'm like happy to give my field a little pushback at times. I believe the field gets stronger by me pushing back against the field. I don't believe that the field will just crumble and die just because I disagree with some statements that we're making. And so this like add friction, I think, is a super important philosophy to me. Now, there was a second question you asked. I'm trying to cut your questions into pieces, which is, how is the field using it at the moment, and how is it positively using it? So there is this possibility now that you can replicate papers much more easily and test papers. So, for example, I have a student I'm working with who is trying to, you upload a paper with the method section and you upload the code base. And it just asks the question, hey, LLM, can you check, does the method section do things that the code base doesn't? And does the code base do things that the method section doesn't?
I'm so scared to hear the results.
And obviously, there's a fair bit of like this deviation happening. And I think there's a general feeling of excitement that we can do these things. Now, this is another example of like adding friction, but it's again constructive friction. And
that's fantastic to throw at like the entire literature, right? Like there's a lot of literature across all fields that probably has enough embedded in it, especially over the last 10, 15 years, that have a lot of code, where we could get a view into the reproducibility of all of these papers everywhere.
Absolutely. And it would be great to do that. And yeah, I should start writing grants for like medium level compute for that. But I mean, like the scale
like Anthropic and DeepMind and OpenAI would be thrilled to like do this.
I think they should do it. And in fact, that's one of the few reasons why I'm sometimes jealous of not working for those companies. But basically, yes. No, like you can do it for $1 of compute per paper. You could basically do the whole literature and make a complete list of which figures replicate, which figures don't replicate, which method section. And there's a lot of differences between what people say they do and what they do. I ran an NSF-funded data sharing grant at some point of time, and good proportion of the literature can't even produce their own figures. Yeah. And that is, these professors were sending it to me. It's not that
even when there's like all the best intention and you try to do this like good work, you still like it's
just
hard.
So easy. It's gotten much better. Now, like now you like put the whole Python repo online. It's much more reliable. But back then, at the time where people were using MATLAB, there was a lot of just difficulty, and as professor you can't replicate it from your students. No, it's just so incoherent, and just replicating it would be wonderful.
This is probably a large thread that we could spend hours talking about. We both care an enormous amount about the tree of knowledge. What do we actually know? How do we know it? What is the evidence? What is the science that we've done? What's reproducible versus not? What is the likelihood of whatever claim exists somewhere in the literature actually being true?
And alternative interpretation. Not like a lot of papers are like A versus B, and you're like, hold on, like there's also C as a possibility. And I bet you there's lots of papers where C is much better than A or B.
Yeah. I think a lot of us are very optimistic about applying AI to a ton of these methods and accelerating science quite a bit. You also have been thinking about the economic impacts of AI, and you recently co-wrote a paper with your wife.
Joanna Marinescu.
Yeah, which, by the way, this is super awesome. The two of you came together and like built this amazing, and combines a lot of your thinking both in how intelligence works and how it gets applied to knowledge work and beyond, and then how economic systems work. What are some of the interesting insights or consequences the two of you think this will produce?
Yeah, so this paper comes kind of from a contrast of two very different ways of thinking. Now, like if you look at the AI world, you're seeing that the price for equivalent tokens exponentially gets cheaper at like a crazy 1 years or sub 1 year time scale. So that is one way of looking at the world. And then you can look at the world from a very different perspective, say the GDP of a country. Then you're like, yeah, we're like growing and like takes us 15 years or something to double. These two frameworks are just so very different. And we started talking about what would happen when those two meet. And let's talk about how the two of them meet. So imagine you have a task, a real task. You want to like dig dirt out of one place and bring it to another place. For that, you need intelligence and you need physical things. You need an excavator and you need someone who sits there and controls the excavator. And if intelligence is very bad, then the physical machine that you have, the excavator, will not be used well. Like you'll be wasting lots of time digging or the excavator gets destroyed. Now, the question is what happens if we now saturate intelligence? We add intelligence and we add even more intelligence until we have unlimited amounts of intelligence. What's going to happen? At some level, this machine here is going to be upper bounded by its physical properties in how much Earth it could move. At some level, it's physically bounded. There's a combustion motor in it, and like it cannot move more than a certain amount of Earth per energy that it burns. So in this task of like having to move Earth, you need a physical piece and you need an intelligence piece. Economics has a history of modeling such phenomena. And the classical framework that people use for things where you need both is labor and capital. Now, like we know from ancient econ literature that you can say, if we want to run a factory, we need a bunch of workers there, and we need a bunch of like physical goods in that company, traditionally capital. And now, how's the interplay between them going to be? There's a certain amount of substitutability. Now, like, imagine people are very expensive and excavators are pretty cheap. Then let's build one mega excavator with just one person controlling it instead of building 100 excavators that are small with like one person each. At the same time, imagine that people get to be like super cheap. Let's hire lots of people with shovels. Shovels are very cheap. And this trade-off between capital and labor, the economists model that with an idea of called constant elasticity of substitution, CES, which basically the idea is that there's a certain friction to like moving from one side to the other. So basically replacing the first human with an excavator is very cheap. Replacing the 100th human with an excavator is very expensive. Representing all humans is impossible, depending on the setting of the parameters of that substitution dynamic. But for a lot of parameters of it, it's basically impossible, I guess, more and more and more expensive as we go in that direction. When we then talked about physical and intelligence capital, it feels like it has a certain similar property. And like if I build AI into like that excavator, like there's a certain limit to it. And so you can say what we then did is we said, well, let's think of the world as four pieces. There exist physical, there exist capital labor. Think about excavators. There exists like human physical, which is think about humans with shovels, but also think about like human doctors who have hands. Think of human nurses that have hands. Think of teachers that have a face that can frown. Like anything that has a body, we call it physical, and anything that doesn't require a body or anything physical, we call intelligence. Now, the idea is that in production, you can say there is a fixed like physical capital, think excavators, and there's like a human physical, think of human bodies broadly construed, and there's a human intelligence and there's an artificial intelligence. And then what happens if we substitute in those areas? And now the question is, how can we substitute physical with intelligence? And the idea is very much not much. Because look, yeah, we can have robots, but the robot is the physical piece of it. And it turns out also, and this is something that I think the AI community often goes wrong, robot scaling isn't intelligence scaling. It doesn't halve every 8 months. Robot scaling is extremely slow, and we build millions of industrial robots, and robots are just capital-wise very expensive. And the reason being, there's this long supply chain that we need to build robots. Can we do it cheaper? Yes. Can we do anything in this universe cheaper? Yes. Does it take time and effort and all that? Also, yes. On the intelligence side, the scaling is very different. And there's even people who say, well, now that we all use Claude Code, and now that all the frontier labs use Claude Code, they will get better at building intelligence. That may be, or maybe that's not the case. I'm not sure. You could make both arguments. You could say the easy things are being done fast, and so maybe we're still at the phase where we do the easy things that we can do with internet scale compute. But maybe that's not, and we don't know. And that's why we want a modeling that brackets that out of the rest. And now you can say, how can we replace physical for intelligence? And in most cases, it's very unclear how you could do that, build a house. Put more intelligence in that. How much faster is that house going to build itself? Very much not at all. Build a better street. How much is intelligence going to help? Not at all. If you want to build bigger robot factories, you need to build streets, and streets scale like streets. They don't scale like AI. So you can say, no, and people are yeah, but I could build $100,000 robot and put super intelligence into it. Yes, if you want the robot that's already there. But if intelligence was went to infinity all of a sudden, that $100,000 robot would be a lot more valuable. In any case, the idea is that replacing physical for intelligence is crazy complicated.
And that's kind of until the scale up of the robotics supply chain can catch up to the demand. What you're kind of getting at is there's going to be this process of, sure, intelligence cost might go to zero, but that just increases the value of a whole bunch of places where you're applying human work, which includes both physical and intelligence. And then eventually, once the robotics production kind of catches up.
Yeah, but it's not just the robots are not unique in the way that AI people think robots are unique. A factory is a robot if you think about it.
Sure.
It has ways of automating much of it.
Yeah.
We've been automating factories for 100 plus years.
Yeah.
And they get better every year. They're more efficient, but it's not that there's super dramatic, unrealized possibility.
There's always this very long tail of tasks that are just incredibly difficult to automate that keep rising in price, right? So you keep automating and then you keep finding the next constraint.
That's right. And not only that, but also for a lot of places, robots aren't even substitutable. You cannot replace a teacher with a robot because there's something about them being human that makes them be attractive as a teacher. And let's just say, if you look at big tech CEOs, they don't have their kids be robot Zoom taught. They have them be in very high intensity human taught environments. And then you can say, what if we now only look at the intelligence production? Do we find this phenomenon that basically humans get replaced massively with AI? That is entirely unclear within that sector, because you can say even within it, now how replaceable are they? It turns out that at least so far it looks that AI doesn't replace the human programmer. Maybe it replaces the entry-level person. But the people who are good at working with AI, they're just so much more productive now. So therefore, it's unclear if the existence of AI kind of moves all the humans out of it. And there's precious little evidence that the tech CEOs are actually being replaced by robots for the time being. And so, but the key is, because of the existence of this physical sector, if the intelligence thing would go to infinity, if the price of any intelligence would go to zero, the economy still wouldn't go to super productive. Sure, what do I know? GDP might double, but it wouldn't 100-fold. It wouldn't 10-fold. It would be probably a medium-sized change. And it very much depends on your assumptions about how close to IQ tapped out we already are. But just give me the real world tasks, more intelligence would actually like produce more. Like car factories are already full of and robot factories are already full of robots. It's not that they don't use robots. It's just that, they need the humans for the outlier tasks, both intellectually and physically.
But that does suggest that there is some threshold after which you can get the recursive self-improvement of the robotics factories going well enough. And there is a very long tail there that I think everyone in the AI community is maybe underappreciating. But at some point, whether this might be, certainly like not in the next 5 to 10 years, but like potentially after, you can get production so well automated that you can then create like a much faster production of physically intelligent capital.
Yeah, but that is not a new phenomenon. No, you can say since the time of the Romans, we had exponential growth. And exponential growth has been in, like the 7% range for quite a bit. And now imagine it goes up to 10. Imagine it goes up to 15, which would be unbelievable. It would still take a very long time. And like the Romans, if they would plot exponential curves, would be like, oh my God, in 200 years, every peasant has unlimited food. And no, instead, they ended up building a big civilization with all kinds of other things. And so I think like exponential move, there's no reason that it will stop. And I think like there's the degrowth movement, which I think is an insanely bad idea. But basically, there's going to be ongoing growth, and we will find new things to spend that wonderful growth on, and it will make our lives much cooler.
This will be like a super interesting area to see and measure over the next few years. I think it'll be like a very big feature of the conversation.
Absolutely. And what in the context of the paper with my wife is really interesting is if we see kind of the canary in the coal mine thing. There's no science at all for substitution of physical for intelligence, because that's very, very difficult. But even within the intelligence sector, like it's not that we see a strong job market drift where this is happening. Now, you can say a lot of it in a lot of our simulations there will be an early period where if you want increased productivity kind of drowns out any effect of substituting people. But even there, if you want, like the upshot is we are kind of somewhat safe because there's so many jobs that require bodies, and we could have a lot more of those jobs. Like we could do a much better job at teaching kids, for example. Like if we had like extra human beings that are jobless, then we probably don't want classes of size 40 to one human teacher. We could probably have one-on-one teaching. And so I personally, my take is that we're rather moving into a very positive world where, so for example, take all that software engineering. Software is horrible. By and large, just like software is just the worst thing ever. And therefore you could say, in the future, is it likely that people have like expectations of quality for software? Yes, and that would be a good thing. And so, it will take a lot of people to get that to happen.
Very good optimistic view on the moment, because it'll just kind of, we'll be able to reap the rewards of all the growth along the way. The economic transition is not going to be as rocky as everybody currently fears it will be. And so,
Right. Yeah. And there's also this phenomenon. People are like, yes, if we build robots and we invest all proceeds of building robots into building more robots, then wouldn't it be like so fast? But that's not how the real world works. In the real world, if your robot factory is making wonderful profits, you'll spend it on like a heli skiing trip in Alaska or whatever else you spend part of your money on. And so the economy tends to like not reinvest all proceeds. It tends to reinvest 20% or something of it. And there's no reason to believe that AI will all of a sudden change that. If people have money, they spend money on doing the things that they believe makes the world better from their perspective. And that could be trips or yachts or like investing in neuroscience progress.
If you were to kind of give an optimistic vision for the future, I don't know, 10, 20, even 40 years out, like what do you find like very exciting, inspiring, cool out there? Like what do you dream about?
Well, there's lots of layers. I think I do dream about understanding brains to the level that we can simulate them. I think the idea that simulations are too far away, well, the simulations have been too far away for 70 years, and we have like so much better techniques, and the idea that simulations must always be a far future dream should go away. We should start simulating brains. I do dream of a world where AI is used by and large in a positive, constructive way that helps people live better lives. And in that sense, I dream of a world where AI is seen less as a competitor with humans, but because I think it's not, and more just like something providing something of value in the same way that a machine, the car, is providing value. And in general, I dream of a world where we use technology to solve a lot of mankind's problems. And I believe that as engineers, we've always been doing it. And I think we will continue doing it. And AI is just part of that.
That's wonderful. Well, thank you so much for coming to chat with us today. Thank you for
It's great
sharing the
fun.
time.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. I hope you enjoyed this episode. This is a new podcast, so we need your help to get the word out. Please like, rate, and subscribe on your favorite platform, and share it with people you think would find it interesting. Thank you. See you next time.